Have you ever stood in your own home and felt like a stranger? I'm talking about that suffocating moment when you're surrounded by everything that should mean home. The wedding photos still hanging on the wall, the shared Netflix account, the joint bank statements scattered on the counter. But the person sleeping 3 feet away from you might as well be on another planet. Maybe that's exactly where you are right now. Maybe you've already got 1 foot out the door. Maybe you picked up this story because you're done trying, done hoping, done pretending that love can survive when it feels like it's already died a slow, quiet death. The coffee's gone cold again. The silence has weight now, pressing down on your chest like a physical thing. You've had the conversation in your head 1,000 times. We need to talk. But those 4 words feel like a death sentence, because you both know what comes next. I was there too. I had the papers ready. Yes, actual papers, printed from a lawyer's website at 2 a.m. when insomnia and desperation made strange bedfellows. I had practiced the conversation in my car, in the shower, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I was 3 words away from saying goodbye forever. This isn't working. But before I quit, I discovered something that changed everything. God was watching. Not judging, not condemning, not keeping score of every harsh word and slammed door. Watching, waiting, working in ways I couldn't see, wouldn't believe, and almost missed entirely. This isn't a fairy tale where everything gets magically fixed with a prayer and a promise. This isn't about pretending that love conquers all when you can barely remember what love felt like. This is about what happens when you're sitting at your kitchen table at 2 a.m., wondering if you married the wrong person, and discovering that maybe the question isn't about them at all. This is about the moment when you're ready to walk away from everything you once called sacred, and finding out that the sacred was never actually in the marriage certificate, or the shared last name, or the anniversary date circled in red on the calendar. The sacred was in the watching, the waiting, the God who sees you in your kitchen, in your silence, in your almost quitting, and whispers, "Not yet. We're not finished here." The plate shattered against the tile floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house, through our entire marriage, through every dream we'd ever shared about growing old together. I stood there for a long moment staring at the white ceramic pieces scattered like broken promises around my bare feet. Sarah had already disappeared upstairs. I heard the bedroom door close with that particular kind of quiet that speaks louder than any slam. The kind of quiet that says, "I'm done fighting. I don't have any more words left." The dishwasher hummed its mechanical lullaby in the background, oblivious to the fact that our marriage was bleeding out in fragments on the kitchen floor. Somewhere in the distance, our neighbor's dog was barking at shadows, and I found myself envying that dog. At least it knew what it was angry about. I knelt down and began picking up the pieces, each shard a small accusation. This was our wedding china, the set her grandmother had given us, the one we'd promised to use for special occasions. When was the last time we'd had a special occasion? When was the last time we'd eaten dinner at the same time, let alone at the same table? The largest piece had a faded rose painted on it, part of the delicate pattern that had once made Sarah's eyes light up in the department store. "It's perfect," she'd whispered then, running her finger along the golden rim. "It's us." It's us. The irony cut deeper than the ceramic edge that caught my thumb. I wrapped the broken pieces in paper towels and threw them away, but the sound of that shattering seemed to hang in the air. How do you throw away 13 years of marriage? How do you decide that the person you once couldn't imagine living without is now someone you can't imagine living with? 2 coffee mugs sat on the counter, still steaming slightly. We'd been having a perfectly ordinary argument about the credit card bill when it escalated. How do arguments always escalate so quickly? One minute we were discussing the mortgage payment, the next minute she was saying things like, "You never listen," and I was responding with gems like, You always exaggerate. Always. Never. The weapons of choice for people who've forgotten how to fight fair, who've started fighting to win instead of fighting to understand. I picked up my mug, the blue one with the chip on the handle that I'd been meaning to replace for 3 years, and took a sip. The coffee was bitter, gone cold in the heat of our argument, like everything else in this house. When did "how was your day" become a question we stopped asking? When did we start choosing separate Netflix shows? When did we migrate to opposite sides of the bed, like 2 continents slowly drifting apart? I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. That was the cruelest part. It wasn't dramatic. There was no affair, no betrayal, no single catastrophic event that broke us. Just the slow erosion of 2 people who'd somehow forgotten how to be 2 people together. The silence pressed against my eardrums. Upstairs, I could hear the shower running. Sarah taking refuge in the one place in the house where tears could disguise themselves as water. I'd done the same thing enough times to recognize the pattern. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard where we'd once planned to build a deck, plant a garden, maybe put up a swing set someday. The grass needed cutting, the fence needed painting. Everything needed something, and neither of us had the energy to give it. My phone sat face down on the counter where I'd thrown it during the argument. Sarah had accused me of caring more about work emails than about us, and maybe she was right. When had checking my phone become easier than checking in with my wife? I picked it up, more out of habit than purpose, and the screen lit up with notifications. 17 work emails, 3 text messages from my brother, and there, somehow wedged between a spam message about car insurance and a reminder about my dentist appointment, a verse from Psalm 34. The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. I stared at the words, frowning. I didn't remember signing up for daily Bible verses. The message was from some app I didn't recognize, probably something I'd downloaded and forgotten about months ago. Broken-hearted, crushed in spirit. Well, that was accurate enough to be insulting. I deleted the message and set the phone back down, but the words seemed to hover in the air like smoke, refusing to dissipate. The Lord is close. Where exactly? Because from where I was standing, in a kitchen full of broken china and broken dreams, close felt like the last thing God was. The shower upstairs stopped running. Soon, Sarah would come down in her robe. We'd navigate around each other like strangers sharing an airport terminal, and we'd go to bed without speaking. Again. I looked around the kitchen one more time, at the empty chairs pushed under the table, at the refrigerator covered with old photos of us looking happy, at the wedding invitation from Sarah's cousin's wedding next month that we'd probably attend with fake smiles and careful distance between us. This was our life now. This was what "till death do us part" had become. But something wouldn't let me turn off the lights and surrender to another night of sleeping back to back. Something wouldn't let me close that browser tab I'd opened earlier, the one with the divorce attorney's website, still glowing on my laptop screen in the living room. Maybe it was the echo of those words. The Lord is close. Or maybe it was just the stubborn, stupid hope that somewhere in the wreckage of us, there might still be something worth saving. I picked up Sarah's coffee mug, the yellow one with the sunflower that I'd given her on our first anniversary, and took a sip. Still warm, still sweet, the way she always made it. The way she still made it, even after 13 years, even after tonight, even when she had every reason to stop trying. Maybe that meant something. Maybe it didn't. But as I stood there in our broken kitchen, holding her coffee mug like a lifeline, I realized I wasn't quite ready to find out. Not yet. Something whispered in the silence. We're not finished here. And for the first time in months, I found myself wondering if that something might be right. The next morning arrived with the cruelty of routine. My alarm buzzed at 6:15, just like it had every weekday for the past 8 years, and I rolled over to find Sarah's side of the bed already empty. The sheets were cool to the touch, which meant she'd been up for a while. Probably couldn't sleep either, probably lay there staring at the ceiling just like I had, both of us pretending the other was asleep, both of us drowning in the space between us that felt wider than the Grand Canyon. I could hear her moving around downstairs, the familiar sounds of morning coffee being made, the refrigerator opening and closing, the gentle clink of dishes. These were the sounds that used to mean comfort. Home. The promise of starting another day together. Now they felt like background noise to a life I was no longer sure I wanted to be living. I used to bound down those stairs, eager to steal a kiss while she waited for her coffee to brew, eager to share whatever random thought had occurred to me in those first moments of consciousness. Now I lay in bed for an extra 10 minutes, dreading the careful dance we'd have to perform around each other, the polite good mornings that carried no warmth. The way we'd both reach for the coffee pot at the same time and do that awkward little shuffle to avoid touching hands. When I finally made it to the kitchen, she was already dressed for work, standing at the counter scrolling through her phone with one hand while holding her travel mug with the other. She looked up when I walked in, and for just a moment, maybe half a second, her face softened into something that almost resembled the woman I'd married. Then the mask slipped back into place, polite and distant and careful. "There's coffee," she said, nodding toward the pot without quite meeting my eyes. "I made extra." "Thanks." I poured myself a cup and added cream, aware of how strange it felt to be thanking my own wife for making coffee in our own kitchen. When had we become so formal with each other? When had common courtesy replaced intimacy? I wanted to say something real, something that might bridge the chasm that had opened between us, but the words felt too big for the moment, too risky for a Tuesday morning when we both had to get to work and pretend to the outside world that we were fine. She finished whatever she was reading on her phone and slipped it into her purse. "I'll probably be late tonight. The Morrison project is due tomorrow and Janet wants to review everything one more time." She was already moving toward the door, already putting distance between us, already choosing work over the conversation we both knew we needed to have. "Okay," I said, though it wasn't okay, though nothing about this was okay. "I'll probably grab dinner with Mark anyway. We're supposed to discuss the Henderson account." It was a lie. I had no plans with Mark, but it felt easier than admitting I'd probably sit alone in this kitchen again, eating take-out Chinese food while scrolling through my phone, pretending I wasn't listening for her car in the driveway. She paused at the doorway, and for a moment I thought she might turn around, might say something real, might crack open this horrible politeness that had become our default mode. Instead, she said, "Don't forget to take the trash out." "It's Tuesday." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and the sound of her car starting in the driveway. I stood there in the sudden silence, holding my coffee mug like an anchor, and tried to remember when we'd started living like roommates who happened to share a mortgage. When had "don't forget the trash" become the extent of our communication? When had we stopped kissing goodbye, stopped saying "I love you" as a send-off, stopped caring whether the other person made it safely to work? The truth was, it hadn't happened all at once. It was death by 1,000 small cuts, each one so minor that we barely noticed until we were bleeding out on our kitchen floor. It started with the promotion that required longer hours, the stress that made us both irritable and defensive. Then came the failed attempts to get pregnant. 2 years of hope followed by disappointment, of doctor's appointments and uncomfortable conversations and the gradual realization that maybe it wasn't going to happen for us. We never talked about how that felt, never processed the grief together, just let it settle between us like a wall made of unsaid words and unshared sorrow. After that came the financial pressure. The mortgage that seemed reasonable when we both thought we'd be making more money by now. The credit card debt that accumulated slowly but steadily. The way money arguments could turn into character assassinations without either of us meaning for it to happen. You're irresponsible with money became you don't care about our future, became you don't care about me. And somewhere along the way, we both stopped trying to prove those accusations wrong. I finished my coffee and got ready for work, going through the motions of a normal day while feeling anything but normal. The drive to the office felt longer than usual, probably because I kept thinking about the conversation we didn't have, the words we didn't say, the kiss goodbye that used to be automatic and now felt like something from a different lifetime. I found myself wondering if this was what my parents had felt like in the months before their divorce. This sense of living parallel lives that occasionally intersected but never truly connected. At work, I threw myself into spreadsheets and conference calls, grateful for the distraction but aware that my colleagues seemed to be operating in full color while I was stuck in grayscale. During lunch, I found myself Googling things like signs your marriage is over and when to know it's time to divorce, then quickly closing the browser windows when someone walked by my desk. It felt like researching my own death, necessary but macabre. Like planning a funeral for something that wasn't quite dead yet, but was clearly dying. The Henderson account meeting with Mark was real after all. He texted me around 3 asking if I wanted to grab drinks and discuss strategy. I said yes immediately, relieved to have somewhere to go besides home. Relieved to have a reason to delay that moment when I'd walk through our front door and feel the weight of all our unfinished business settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. We met at O'Malley's, the same bar where we'd celebrated landing our biggest client 3 years ago, where I'd called Sarah from the parking lot to tell her the good news, and she'd screamed with excitement and told me she was proud of me. Now, I sat in the same booth, nursing the same brand of beer, and wondered if she even remembered what I did for a living anymore. We'd stopped sharing the details of our days, stopped being interested in each other's victories and defeats, stopped being each other's first phone call when something important happened. Mark was talking about quarterly projections and market penetration, but I kept drifting, kept thinking about the way Sarah's face had looked that morning. Not angry, not sad, just tired. Tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Tired in a way that suggested she was carrying the same weight I was. The weight of trying to love someone when you couldn't remember why you fell in love with them in the first place. "You okay, man?" Mark asked, and I realized I'd been staring into my beer for the better part of 5 minutes while he talked about client retention strategies. "Yeah, just distracted. Things at home are..." I trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. Complicated, falling apart, dead in the water. Challenging, I settled on, which felt like the understatement of the century. Mark nodded knowingly. He'd been through his own divorce 2 years ago, a messy affair involving custody battles and asset division and the kind of bitterness that leaked into every conversation. "You want to talk about it?" I almost said yes. Almost opened up about the silence that had taken over our house, about the way we moved around each other like ghosts, about the browser tab still open on my laptop with the divorce attorney's contact information glowing like a neon exit sign. But then I thought about Sarah's face that morning, about the way she'd made extra coffee even though we'd barely spoken since the plate incident, about the yellow sunflower mug that still sat in our cabinet, even though she could have thrown it away years ago. "Not yet," I said instead, "but thanks." Mark studied my face for a moment, then signaled the bartender for another round. "You know what the worst part about divorce is?" he asked. "It's not the lawyers or the paperwork or even splitting up your stuff. It's the moment you realize that the person you thought you'd grow old with is actually a stranger. That somewhere along the way you both became people the other person doesn't recognize anymore." His words hit me like a physical blow, probably because they were so accurate it hurt. When was the last time I'd felt like I knew Sarah, really knew her? When was the last time we'd had a conversation that went deeper than logistics and schedules and who was picking up groceries? When was the last time we'd laughed together about something stupid, or stayed up late talking about our dreams, or made love like we meant it, instead of going through the motions because it was Saturday night and that's what married people were supposed to do? I drove home around 9, taking the long way and driving slower than necessary, prolonging the moment when I'd have to face the reality of our shared space. The house was dark except for the light over the kitchen sink, which meant Sarah was already upstairs, probably in bed reading or watching Netflix on her iPad, probably relieved that she wouldn't have to navigate another awkward evening of careful conversation and strategic silence. I found a note on the kitchen counter, written in her careful handwriting. "Your dinner is in the fridge. Chicken stir-fry. Heat for 90 seconds. She'd made dinner for me even though I'd told her I was eating with Mark, even though we'd barely spoken all day, even though she had every right to be angry about the way our morning had played out. The kindness of it made my chest tight with something that felt suspiciously like grief. I heated up the stir-fry and ate it standing at the counter, trying not to think about how perfectly she'd seasoned it, how she'd remembered to add extra broccoli because she knew I liked vegetables, how even in the middle of whatever this crisis was, she was still taking care of me in small, quiet ways that I'd probably been taking for granted for years. Upstairs, I could hear the television murmuring softly through our bedroom door. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, debating whether to knock, whether to try to start the conversation we both knew was coming, whether to crawl into bed beside her and pretend that proximity could substitute for intimacy. Instead, I went to the guest room and pulled out my laptop, telling myself I had work to finish, but knowing I was really just avoiding the awkwardness of lying 3 feet away from someone who felt like a stranger. The divorce attorney's website was still open in my browser, just like it had been for the past week. I'd read every page, memorized the fee structure, even filled out the initial consultation form without submitting it. It felt like holding a loaded gun, terrifying and powerful and final in a way that made my hands shake every time I thought about clicking send. But tonight, instead of staring at the attorney's smiling headshot and wondering if she specialized in amicable divorces, I found myself thinking about Sarah's note, about the extra coffee, about the dinner waiting in the refrigerator, even though she had every reason to let me fend for myself. I thought about the way she'd looked at me that morning, tired but not angry, disappointed but not hateful. I thought about the fact that we were both sleeping in separate rooms, but neither of us had suggested making it permanent, that we were both miserable, but neither of us had actually said the word divorce out loud. Maybe that meant something. Maybe it meant we were both holding onto the same thin thread of hope, both afraid to be the first one to let go completely. Or maybe it just meant we were both cowards, too scared to face the logistics of untangling 13 years of shared life, too terrified to admit that the great love story we'd thought we were living had turned into a cautionary tale about what happens when 2 people stop fighting for each other and start just fighting. I closed the laptop without looking at the attorney's website, without filling out any forms, without making any decisions that couldn't be unmade. Tomorrow would bring another careful morning dance, another day of parallel lives, another evening of strategic avoidance. But tonight, in the guest room of the house we'd bought together when we still believed in forever, I found myself thinking about that text message from the morning, the one with the Bible verse I'd deleted so quickly. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Broken-hearted. That part was definitely accurate. Crushed in spirit. That too. But close? Where was close when you needed it most? Where was close when you were lying alone in a guest room, listening to your wife breathe in the next room and wondering if you'd ever sleep in the same bed again? Where was close when you were one click away from ending everything you'd once held sacred? I turned off the light and lay there in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of our house settling around me. The creak of floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing on our street. These were the sounds of home, the sounds I'd been hearing for 8 years, the sounds that used to bring comfort and now just emphasized how alone I felt, even when I wasn't alone. But as I lay there, somewhere between sleep and despair, I found myself wondering if maybe, just maybe, being broken-hearted didn't mean being abandoned, if maybe being crushed in spirit didn't mean being forgotten. If maybe close didn't always feel like close, especially when everything else felt like it was falling apart. And for the second night in a row, something wouldn't let me completely give up. Something kept whispering in the silence between heartbeats, in the space between Sarah's breathing and my own. Not yet. We're not finished here. I had no idea if that something was God, or hope, or just the stubborn refusal of love to die quietly. But as I finally drifted off to sleep in a guest room that felt like exile from my own life, I decided that maybe, for tonight at least, it didn't matter what I called it. What mattered was that it was still there, still whispering, still holding the door open just a crack, still watching. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of careful politeness and strategic avoidance, each day a masterclass in how two people could share a life without actually living it together. I started keeping a mental inventory of all the things we'd lost along the way, not the big dramatic losses that would make for good divorce court testimony, but the small, everyday intimacies that had somehow evaporated like morning dew, leaving behind only the memory of what used to be. We used to share a morning routine that felt like a dance choreographed by affection. She'd make the coffee while I let the dog out. I'd toast the bagels while she packed her lunch, and we'd steal kisses in the kitchen between the ordinary tasks that make up a life. Now we moved around each other like strangers in a crowded elevator, overly polite and careful not to touch, both of us pretending we had urgent business elsewhere. The coffee maker still burbled to life at the same time every morning, but now it felt less like a morning symphony and more like background noise to the careful choreography of two people who'd forgotten how to be comfortable in the same space. We used to text each other throughout the day, silly things mostly, links to articles we thought the other would find interesting, photos of dogs we saw on the street, random thoughts that occurred to us while we were apart. My phone used to buzz with messages from her several times a day, little digital breadcrumbs that reminded me I was loved, I was thought about, I mattered to someone in the world. Now, my phone stayed silent, except for work emails and spam messages, and when I did receive the occasional text from Sarah, it was purely logistical. Can you pick up milk? Dinner with your sister is at 7. The dishwasher is making that noise again. We'd become business partners, managing the corporation of our shared life, efficient and professional, and completely devoid of any warmth that might suggest we actually enjoyed each other's company. We used to watch television together on the couch, not because we always agreed on what to watch, but because being together was more important than whatever was happening on the screen. She'd stretch out with her head on my lap during the boring parts. I'd play with her hair while she dozed off during action movies she'd pretended to want to see. We'd pause shows to talk about plot holes or share random memories triggered by something an actor said, turning a simple evening at home into an ongoing conversation about everything and nothing. Now we watched separate shows on separate devices in separate rooms, and when we did occasionally find ourselves in the living room at the same time, we sat on opposite ends of the couch with enough space between us for another person, each of us scrolling through our phones while Netflix asked if we were still watching shows we'd never actually been watching in the first place. We used to cook dinner together on weekends, turning meal preparation into an excuse to drink wine and talk about our weeks and accidentally bump into each other while reaching for the same cabinet. She'd taste whatever I was making and offer suggestions in that diplomatic way that meant, "This needs salt, but I love you too much to say so directly," and I'd steal bites from her prep work and get my hand slapped away with a wooden spoon. Our kitchen used to feel alive with conversation and laughter and the comfortable chaos of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Now we took turns cooking, one person preparing food for two people who would eat in silence while checking their phones, the kitchen feeling less like the heart of our home and more like a cafeteria where we happened to share a table. We used to make love like we meant it, like we were trying to say something important with our bodies that words couldn't capture. Saturday mornings used to stretch into lazy afternoons, conversations flowing seamlessly from pillow talk to deeper discussions about our dreams and fears and the life we were building together. Physical intimacy used to feel like a natural extension of emotional intimacy, a way of connecting that reminded us why we'd chosen each other out of all the possible people in the world. Now we had sex occasionally, usually late at night when we'd both had just enough wine to lower our inhibitions, but not enough to forget how awkward we'd become with each other. It felt perfunctory, like checking an item off a list of things married people were supposed to do, and afterwards we'd roll to opposite sides of the bed and pretend to fall asleep immediately, rather than risk the vulnerability of post-intimacy conversation. We used to fight better, passionately but fairly, with the understanding that we were on the same team even when we disagreed about strategy. Arguments used to end with apologies and better understanding and sometimes make-up sex that reminded us why we'd fallen in love with someone who could challenge us intellectually and emotionally. We used to fight like people who believed in the possibility of resolution, who trusted that love was strong enough to survive disagreement and even occasional unfairness. Now our arguments felt less like passionate disagreements and more like character assassinations, each of us stockpiling ammunition for the next battle, each conversation potentially the one that would finally convince us both that this was hopeless, that we were incompatible, that we'd been fooling ourselves all along. The physical space of our house had become a map of our emotional distance. We'd started sleeping on opposite sides of our king-size bed, then gradually migrating further apart until we were each clinging to our respective edges, like survivors on a life raft who weren't sure they wanted to save each other anymore. Then came the nights when one of us would claim the guest room because of snoring or insomnia or the need to get up early. And gradually those nights became more frequent until sleeping separately felt normal and sleeping together felt like an intrusion on carefully established boundaries. Our shared bathroom had become a study in strategic scheduling. She showered at night, I showered in the morning, and we both brushed our teeth with the efficiency of people who were trying to minimize contact rather than maximize intimacy. The medicine cabinet held 2 sets of everything now, his and hers versions of products we used to share. Physical evidence of how we'd slowly separated even the most mundane aspects of our daily lives. Even our towels hung on opposite sides of the bathroom, as if sharing a towel rack might force us to acknowledge that we were still, technically, sharing a life. The refrigerator used to be covered with photos of us looking happy, vacation pictures, dinner party snapshots, silly selfies taken during random moments of joy that we'd wanted to preserve and display. Gradually, those photos had been covered by more practical items, shopping lists, appointment reminders, takeout menus for restaurants we ordered from when neither of us felt like cooking for the other. The visual evidence of our happiness had been buried under the administrative details of adult life, as if joy was just another thing we no longer had time for in our busy schedule of careful avoidance. Our friends had started inviting us to different events, probably sensing the tension even when we tried to present a united front. Sarah would go to girls' nights and book clubs and wine tastings, while I found myself accepting invitations to poker games and sporting events and any excuse to be somewhere other than home. We'd become the couple that people felt sorry for, the ones who showed up to parties separately and spent the evening talking to different groups of people, the ones who made other couples grateful for their own relationships simply by comparison. But perhaps the most devastating item in my inventory of lost things was the way we used to talk about the future. We used to make plans that extended beyond next week's calendar, Used to dream together about vacations we'd take and houses we might buy and the ways we'd spend our retirement years. We used to talk about growing old together like it was a given, like it was something to look forward to rather than something to endure. Now, we couldn't even decide what to have for dinner without tension, couldn't plan a weekend without negotiations that felt more like hostage situations than conversations between people who supposedly loved each other. The cruelest part was how gradual it had all been. If someone had told me on our wedding day that love could die this slowly, this quietly, without any dramatic betrayals or catastrophic events, I would have laughed at them. I would have pointed to the way Sarah looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, the way she squeezed my hand during the pastor's sermon about the challenges marriage would bring, the way she whispered, "I can't wait to be your wife," during our first dance. I would have been so confident in our ability to weather whatever storms might come, so sure that the love we felt in that moment was strong enough to sustain us through anything life might throw our way. But love, I was learning, could be eroded just as effectively by neglect as by betrayal. It could die from 1,000 small cuts, forgotten anniversaries, conversations that never happened, assumptions that replaced actual communication, the gradual prioritization of individual comfort over shared intimacy. It could suffocate under the weight of unexpressed resentments and unmet expectations and the simple, devastating habit of taking each other for granted until taking each other for granted became taking each other for gone. I found myself thinking about our wedding day more often than was probably healthy, not in a nostalgic way, but in the manner of someone examining evidence from a crime scene, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. Had the seeds of our current misery been planted even then, hidden beneath the flowers and champagne and carefully orchestrated joy? Or had we really been as happy as I remembered, as confident in our forever as we'd seemed in all those photos that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life? The wedding had been perfect in the way that Sarah always managed to make things perfect. Every detail thoughtfully planned, every potential problem anticipated and solved before it could become an actual issue. She'd spent months coordinating with florists and caterers and photographers, transforming her stress into spreadsheets and timelines and backup plans for backup plans. I'd watched her orchestrate the entire event with the precision of a military operation, and I'd fallen in love with her all over again, amazed by her ability to create beauty and meaning out of what could have been just another expensive party. The morning of our wedding, I'd woken up in my best man's hotel room feeling like the luckiest man alive. Mark had made coffee in the tiny hotel room coffee maker, and we'd sat on the balcony overlooking the lake, where Sarah and I would exchange vows in just a few hours, talking about marriage and responsibility and the weird transition from boyfriend to husband that would happen with a few simple words and the exchange of rings. I remembered feeling so ready for it, so excited to call her my wife, so confident that whatever challenges marriage might bring, we'd face them together with the same teamwork and communication that had gotten us through 3 years of dating and a year-long engagement. I remembered the moment I first saw her walking down the aisle, how the breath had literally left my lungs, and I'd had to grip the altar rail to keep my knees from buckling. She'd looked like something out of a fairy tale. Radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the dress or the makeup or the professional photography capturing every moment. She'd looked like home, like safety, like the answer to every question I'd ever had about what I wanted my life to look like. The smile on her face as she walked toward me had been so full of joy and anticipation and absolute trust that I'd started crying right there in front of 150 guests. Not caring who saw, or what anyone thought about the groom who couldn't keep it together during the processional. Our vows had been traditional, but heartfelt, the standard promises about sickness and health and richer and poorer that thousands of couples before us had made and thousands after us would make. But when we'd said them, looking into each other's eyes while her father officiated the ceremony. They'd felt like the most important words either of us had ever spoken. For better or for worse had seemed like a romantic adventure rather than a warning label. Till death do us part had felt like a promise we'd keep easily, naturally, without even having to think about it. The reception had been a celebration of not just our love, but the community that had supported us getting to that point. Sarah's grandmother had given a toast about watching love grow between two people who were clearly meant for each other. My college roommate had told embarrassing stories about the early days of our relationship that had everyone laughing and Sarah blushing in that way that made me want to protect her and show her off at the same time. We danced to "At Last" by Etta James, and I'd whispered in her ear about how I couldn't wait to wake up next to her every morning for the rest of my life, how I couldn't imagine being happier than I was in that exact moment. During the father-daughter dance, I'd watched Sarah and her dad from across the room, and I'd been struck by how much trust she was placing in me. Her father was essentially handing over responsibility for his daughter's happiness, trusting that I would love her and protect her and prioritize her well-being for the rest of her life. It had felt like the most sacred responsibility anyone had ever given me, and I'd been so sure I was up for the challenge, so confident that loving Sarah would be the easiest thing I'd ever do. The honeymoon had been 2 weeks in Italy, wandering through museums and vineyards and ancient cities, talking for hours about everything and nothing, making love like newlyweds who couldn't get enough of each other. We'd talked about buying a house and starting a family and growing old together in rocking chairs on a front porch somewhere, watching our grandchildren play in a yard full of flowers that Sarah would plant, and I would pretend to know how to maintain. The future had stretched out before us, like a golden highway, full of possibilities and adventures, and the simple, profound joy of building a life with someone who understood you completely. Those first few years of marriage had been exactly what I'd expected. Not perfect, but good in the way that felt sustainable and real. We'd had our first apartment with its leaky faucet and thin walls, and the upstairs neighbors who played music too loud on weeknight evenings. Sarah had painted the kitchen yellow because she said it would make us happier in the mornings, and she'd been right. I'd assembled furniture from IKEA while she read the directions aloud and tried not to laugh when I inevitably put something on backwards or upside down. We'd hosted dinner parties for friends and family, proud to show off our little domestic nest, proud to be the couple who had their act together even when we absolutely didn't. We'd weathered the normal challenges of early marriage, learning how to fight fair, figuring out whose turn it was to take out the trash, negotiating holiday schedules with both sets of parents, managing money in a way that didn't lead to resentment or power struggles. We'd supported each other through job changes and family drama and the ordinary stresses of adult life, and I'd felt so grateful to have a partner who made even the difficult things feel manageable. But somewhere along the way, and I couldn't pinpoint exactly when, the golden highway had started to feel more like a treadmill. The adventures we'd planned got postponed and then forgotten as work demands increased, and free time became more precious and harder to coordinate. The front porch with rocking chairs started feeling less like a romantic dream and more like a distant fantasy, something we'd get around to someday when we had more money, more time, more energy to invest in the shared vision that had once felt so achievable. The house we'd eventually bought had felt like a symbol of our success, proof that we were doing marriage right, that we were building something lasting and valuable together. But it had also come with a mortgage that required both of us to work longer hours, leaving less time for the conversations and shared activities that had once been the foundation of our relationship. The extra bedrooms we'd planned to fill with children remained empty month after month, year after year, becoming a source of tension and disappointment that we never quite learned how to discuss without someone ending up hurt or defensive. Now, sitting in that same house 8 years later, I found myself wondering if we'd been naive to think that love could sustain itself without constant attention and nurturing. Had we expected too much from marriage, assumed that the feelings that had carried us to the altar would automatically carry us through decades of ordinary life? Had we mistaken the excitement of being newlyweds for the deeper, more sustainable love that was supposed to grow over time? Looking back, I could see the moments where we'd chosen convenience over connection, efficiency over intimacy, individual comfort over shared growth. Neither of us had made these choices maliciously or even consciously. They just seemed like the natural response to the demands of adult life. But accumulated over years, those small choices had created a marriage that looked successful from the outside, but felt hollow from the inside, like a beautiful house with no one home. The worst part was that I could still see glimpses of the people we'd been on our wedding day, still catch moments when Sarah's laugh would remind me of why I'd fallen in love with her in the first place, still feel echoes of the connection that had once made us feel invincible together. It would have been easier if we'd become completely different people, if we could point to specific moments where everything had changed. Instead, we were still recognizably ourselves, just sadder, more tired, more afraid of being hurt than excited about being loved. The point of no return. The conversation I'd been dreading finally happened on a Thursday evening in late October, triggered by something as mundane as a disagreement about whose turn it was to call the plumber about our constantly running toilet. What started as a minor logistical discussion escalated into accusations about who was more responsible, who cared more about maintaining our home, who was pulling their weight in the relationship, and who was just coasting on the other person's efforts. I scheduled the last 3 repair appointments, Sarah said, her voice carrying that particular edge that meant she was about 30 seconds away from saying something we'd both regret. The electrician, the guy who fixed the garage door, and the heating repair last month. When was the last time you handled anything that required making a phone call during business hours? I wanted to point out that I'd been working 60-hour weeks for the past 2 months trying to land the Peterson account, that I'd been handling the yard work and the car maintenance and about a dozen other household responsibilities that apparently didn't count in her mental ledger of who was contributing what to our shared life. Instead, I heard myself saying, "When was the last time you acknowledged anything I do around here instead of just keeping score like we're competing for some kind of marriage trophy?" The fight that followed was like watching a controlled demolition. Everything fell apart with devastating precision, each accusation landing exactly where it would do the most damage. She brought up the fact that I'd forgotten our anniversary last month, and I countered with the observation that she'd been too busy with work projects to notice until 3 days later. I mentioned that she never seemed interested in sex anymore unless it was scheduled on the calendar like a dental appointment, and she responded that maybe she'd be more interested if I showed any interest in her thoughts or feelings outside the bedroom. We stood in our kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd shared so many meals and conversations and quiet moments of domestic contentment, and systematically dismantled 13 years of shared history with the efficiency of people who knew exactly where to strike for maximum impact. Every old wound was reopened, every past disappointment was weaponized, every moment of tenderness we'd ever shared was reframed as evidence of how far we'd fallen from the people we used to be. "Maybe this isn't working," Sarah said finally, the words hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that had already burned everything down. "Maybe we're just incompatible. Maybe we've been trying to force something that was never meant to last this long." The relief I felt at hearing someone finally say it out loud was almost as devastating as the fear that crashed over me immediately afterward. Yes, I thought, maybe we are incompatible. Maybe we have been forcing it. Maybe the smart thing, the healthy thing, the kind thing would be to admit defeat and start the process of untangling our lives before we did any more damage to each other. But even as part of me was mentally calculating how to divide our belongings and wondering whether I could afford to keep the house, another part of me was thinking about the dinner she'd left for me the night before. About the way she still made my coffee exactly the way I liked it, even when we weren't speaking. About the fact that she'd been crying in the shower earlier that week, and I'd wanted to comfort her but hadn't known how to bridge the distance we'd created between us. "Is that what you want?" I asked, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, like it was coming from someone else entirely. "Do you want to get divorced?" She was quiet for a long time, long enough for me to notice that her hands were shaking slightly and that she was biting her lower lip the way she did when she was trying not to cry. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and for a moment she looked like the woman I'd married, vulnerable and scared and hoping I would know how to fix this, even though we both knew I didn't. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what I want anymore. I just know that this—" She gestured around the kitchen, around our life, around the invisible wall that had grown between us. "This isn't what I thought marriage would feel like. I thought we'd be partners. I thought we'd be friends. I thought we'd still like each other after all these years." The honesty in her voice broke something inside my chest that I hadn't realized was still intact. When had we stopped being friends? When had we stopped enjoying each other's company? When had we started feeling like adversaries instead of allies, like people who were stuck with each other rather than people who had chosen each other? "I don't know either," I admitted, and it felt like the first honest thing either of us had said in months. "I don't know how we got here. I don't know how to fix it. I don't even know if it can be fixed." We stood there in the aftermath of our honesty, both of us crying now, both of us scared and sad and lost in a way that felt too big for our kitchen, too big for our house, too big for anything we'd learned about how to be married to each other. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we'd said and everything we hadn't said, everything we'd lost and everything we were afraid of losing. Finally, Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and said, "Maybe we should take some time. Think about things. Figure out what we really want." I nodded, even though I had no idea what taking time would look like or how we were supposed to figure out what we wanted, when what we wanted seemed to change every day, depending on how tired we were, or how hopeful we felt, or how much we missed the people we used to be when we were together. "Okay," I said. "Time." She went upstairs first, and I stayed in the kitchen for a long time afterward, sitting at the table where we'd shared thousands of meals, looking around at the space that had once felt like the heart of our home, and now felt like a crime scene. The house was quiet, except for the sound of that stupid toilet running in the guest bathroom, the repair that had started our fight, the mundane problem that had somehow triggered the conversation that might end our marriage. I pulled out my phone and stared at it for a while, thinking about the divorce attorney's website that was still bookmarked in my browser, thinking about the forms I could fill out and the calls I could make and the process I could start that would officially begin the end of everything we'd built together. It would be so easy. A few clicks, a few phone calls, a few signatures on legal documents, and I could be free of this sadness that seemed to permeate every corner of our shared life. But my finger hovered over the screen without making contact, and I found myself thinking instead about the tears in Sarah's eyes, about the way she'd looked when she'd said she didn't know what she wanted anymore. She'd looked like someone who was drowning, like someone who was hoping desperately that someone else would throw her a life preserver, even though she didn't know how to ask for help. And maybe that was the thing I'd been missing in all my mental calculations about compatibility and happiness and whether love was supposed to feel this hard. Maybe Sarah wasn't my adversary, Maybe she was just as lost as I was, just as scared about what came next, just as confused about how two people who had once loved each other so completely could end up feeling like strangers sharing a mortgage and a last name. Maybe we were both drowning, and maybe the solution wasn't to swim away from each other as fast as possible, but to figure out how to save each other, how to be the life preserver the other person needed, even when we didn't know how to save ourselves. But as I sat there in our kitchen, surrounded by the debris of the life we'd built together, I had no idea how to do that. I had no idea how to bridge the distance between us, how to start a conversation that might lead somewhere other than more pain. How to love someone when love felt like the hardest thing in the world instead of the most natural. All I knew was that I wasn't quite ready to make that phone call, wasn't quite ready to fill out those forms, wasn't quite ready to be the one who finally said the word divorce out loud and made it real. Not yet, something whispered in the silence. We're not finished here. And for the third time in as many weeks, I found myself wondering if that something might know more about love and hope and second chances than I did. The days following our kitchen conversation felt like living in purgatory. We were still married, but not really together, still sharing a house, but moving through it like ghosts who occasionally acknowledged each other's existence with careful nods and polite requests to pass the salt. Sarah had moved completely into the guest room, claiming she needed space to think, and I had thrown myself into work with the desperation of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts. But the thinking was happening anyway, usually in the quiet hours after midnight when I lay in our suddenly enormous bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of how we'd gotten here. The house felt different without her presence beside me. Colder somehow, even though the thermostat hadn't changed. Her pillow still smelled faintly of her shampoo, and I found myself burying my face in it some nights, trying to remember what it felt like to fall asleep next to someone who loved me, trying to recapture even a shadow of the intimacy we'd once taken for granted. Work became my refuge, the one place where I still felt competent and useful and capable of solving problems that had clear solutions. I started arriving at the office earlier and staying later, volunteering for projects that would require travel, accepting every dinner invitation and networking event that crossed my desk. Anything to avoid going home to the careful silence and the weight of decisions that felt too big for me to make alone. But even work couldn't completely distract me from the constant buzz of anxiety that had taken up residence in my chest, the feeling that I was standing at the edge of a cliff and couldn't decide whether to step back or jump. Every phone call could be Sarah asking for a formal separation. Every email notification made my heart race, wondering if she'd finally made up her mind about what she wanted our future to look like. The uncertainty was almost worse than any definitive answer would have been. 3 weeks after our kitchen confrontation, I found myself sitting in my car in the parking lot of Morrison & Associates, the law firm whose website I'd bookmarked but never visited. I'd driven there after work, without really making a conscious decision to do so, just following some internal autopilot that had guided me to the place where I could finally get answers about what divorce would actually look like, financially, logistically, practically. The building was modern and professional, the kind of place that specialized in making difficult transitions as painless as possible for people who had the money to pay for efficiency and discretion. Through the large windows, I could see the reception area with its expensive furniture and carefully curated artwork, designed to make clients feel sophisticated rather than desperate, successful rather than heartbroken. I sat there for nearly an hour, engine running, air conditioning humming, watching other people walk in and out of the building that might hold the key to my future. Some looked relieved, like they'd finally taken control of situations that had been controlling them. Others looked shell-shocked, like they couldn't quite believe they'd reached the point where lawyers and legal documents were necessary to untangle lives that had once been seamlessly integrated. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I assumed it would be work-related, or maybe my brother asking about weekend plans. Instead, it was from a number I didn't recognize, with a message that made me do a double take. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Joshua 1:9. I stared at the screen, frowning. Another random Bible verse from another unknown source, just like the Psalm 34 message that had appeared after our plate-breaking night. I'd never signed up for any religious text services. Didn't belong to any church that had my phone number. Couldn't think of any explanation for why these messages were appearing at moments when I felt most lost and uncertain. Be strong and courageous. The words felt simultaneously comforting and irritating, like advice from someone who had never sat in a law firm parking lot, wondering whether their marriage was worth saving, or whether they were just too scared to admit it was already over. What did courage look like in this situation? Was it brave to fight for something that might be beyond repair, or was it brave to admit defeat and start over? Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Easy for an ancient Bible verse to say. Harder to practice when you were afraid of making the wrong choice, discouraged by months of failed attempts at connection, terrified that whatever decision you made would be one you'd regret for the rest of your life. The Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. This was the part that felt most foreign, most difficult to believe. If God was really with me, where had he been during all those silent dinners and sleepless nights, and conversations that ended in accusations rather than understanding? Where was he during the slow erosion of everything I'd once held sacred about love and commitment, and the promise I'd made to love Sarah until death parted us? I deleted the message, just like I'd deleted the previous one, but the words seemed to linger in my mind like smoke from a fire I couldn't quite extinguish. There was something persistent about these intrusions, something that refused to be dismissed as easily as spam messages or wrong numbers. They felt too well-timed, too relevant to my specific situation to be entirely coincidental. But I wasn't ready to believe in divine intervention or miraculous timing or any of the spiritual explanations that might make sense of Bible verses appearing on my phone during moments of crisis. I was barely ready to believe that my marriage could survive another month, let alone that God was somehow orchestrating text messages to provide comfort and guidance I hadn't asked for and wasn't sure I wanted. I turned off the engine and walked toward the law firm's entrance, telling myself that getting information wasn't the same as making a decision, that understanding my options was just responsible planning rather than an admission of defeat. The receptionist was professionally friendly, offering coffee and forms to fill out while I waited for my consultation with Attorney Morrison, who specialized in amicable dissolutions and collaborative divorce processes. But as I sat in the elegant waiting room, surrounded by other people who were also presumably there to end marriages that had once begun with hope and celebration and promises of forever, I found myself thinking about Sarah's tears during our kitchen conversation, about the way she'd looked when she'd said she didn't know what she wanted anymore. She'd looked lost, not angry, confused, not vindictive, like someone who was hoping desperately that someone else would have answers she couldn't find on her own. When Attorney Morrison called my name, I stood up automatically, but my feet seemed reluctant to carry me toward her office. Something was pulling me in the opposite direction, some internal resistance that felt stronger than logic or practicality, or even the fear of continued unhappiness. It felt like the same something that had been whispering, "not yet," during my late-night moments of despair. The same persistent voice that seemed to believe in possibilities I couldn't see. "Actually," I heard myself saying to the receptionist, "I need to reschedule. Something's come up." She looked mildly surprised but professionally accommodating, offering alternative appointment times while I gathered my jacket and keys and headed back toward the parking lot with no clear idea of where I was going or what I planned to do instead of signing divorce papers. In my car, I sat for another few minutes, trying to understand what had just happened. Had I chickened out of making a difficult but necessary decision? Or had I listened to some deeper wisdom that understood things my conscious mind was still too scared or stubborn to acknowledge? My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Sarah. Made dinner. Your favorite. If you want to join me. I stared at the message, reading it 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining the invitation. She'd made dinner. My favorite. She was asking me to come home, to sit at our kitchen table, to share a meal like we used to do when eating together felt natural instead of loaded with potential conflict. It wasn't an apology exactly, and it wasn't a declaration that she'd changed her mind about needing time to think. But it was an olive branch, a small gesture that suggested she might be as tired of our Cold War as I was. As ready to try something different than the careful avoidance that had become our default mode of interaction. I drove home faster than was probably legal, suddenly eager to see what this invitation might mean, suddenly hopeful that maybe we weren't as finished as we'd thought. The house smelled like garlic and herbs when I walked through the front door. Like the home it used to be when Sarah cooked with joy rather than obligation, when our kitchen was the heart of our shared life rather than a battleground for accumulated resentments. She was standing at the stove, still in her work clothes but with an apron tied around her waist, stirring something that smelled like love and effort and the possibility of peace. When she looked up and saw me, she smiled. Not the careful, polite smile she'd been wearing for weeks, but something softer, more genuine, more like the woman I'd married. "Hi," she said simply. "Hi," I replied, and it felt like the first real conversation we'd had in months. We sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd had our devastating fight 3 weeks earlier, and we ate dinner together without the television on, without our phones beside our plates, without the defensive posturing that had become so automatic we'd forgotten what it felt like to just be ourselves with each other. The food was perfect. My favorite pasta with the sauce she made from scratch, the salad with exactly the right amount of dressing, the bread she'd bought from the bakery I loved but never remembered to visit myself. We talked carefully at first, about work and weather and safe topics that wouldn't trigger another argument. But gradually, tentatively, we began to share real things. How scared we'd both been during our weeks of silence. How exhausting it was to live like roommates instead of partners. How much we missed feeling like a team instead of like adversaries who happened to share a mortgage. "I've been thinking," Sarah said as we cleared the dishes together, moving around our kitchen with some echo of the choreography we'd once perfected. "Maybe we gave up too quickly. Maybe we let the hard parts convince us that we weren't good at this, instead of recognizing that marriage is supposed to be hard sometimes." I dried the plate she handed me, thinking about the law firm I'd almost visited, about the forms I'd almost filled out, about how close I'd come to making a decision that would have ended this conversation before it could begin. "I think you're right," I said. "I think we forgot that being married to each other was supposed to be worth fighting for." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in months. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of hope. "So what do we do now?" she asked. I didn't have an answer that felt adequate to the magnitude of the question, but I had a beginning. "Maybe we start with this," I said, gesturing to the space between us, to the tentative peace we'd managed to create over dinner and honest conversation. "Maybe we start with remembering that we actually like each other when we're not busy being afraid of each other." She nodded, and I could see that she was crying again, but these tears looked different from the ones she'd shed during our kitchen fight. These looked like relief, like gratitude, like the tears of someone who'd been preparing for the worst and had suddenly been offered the possibility of something better. We went to bed in the same room that night for the first time in weeks, not because all our problems were solved, but because we'd remembered that we were supposed to be solving them together rather than in separate corners of our house. We lay there in the darkness, not touching but not actively avoiding touch either. and I found myself thinking about those strange text messages, about the persistence of hope, even when I'd been convinced hope was foolish. "Be strong and courageous," the verse had said. Maybe courage wasn't about making dramatic gestures or bold declarations. Maybe it was about showing up for dinner when you'd rather hide, about choosing connection over self-protection, about believing that love could survive even when it felt fragile and uncertain and nothing like the fairy tale you'd expected. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Maybe the fear wasn't something to overcome, but something to acknowledge and then choose to act in spite of. Maybe discouragement was just another word for forgetting that good things could take time to grow, that some of the most beautiful flowers bloomed slowly and only after surviving harsh winters. The Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Maybe this was what divine presence looked like, not dramatic interventions or miraculous transformations, but the quiet persistence of hope in moments when hope seemed impossible. The way love could surprise you by refusing to die even when you'd given it every reason to give up. As I lay there listening to Sarah breathe beside me, feeling grateful for her presence and terrified of losing it and determined to figure out how to keep it, I realized that something had shifted in me during the past few hours. Not everything, not dramatically, but enough to make me believe that maybe we weren't finished here after all. Maybe we were just getting started on learning how to love each other the way people love each other after they've survived something that could have destroyed them but didn't. Maybe we were just beginning to understand that the real marriage, the one that would last, the one that would be worth having, was built not on the foundation of easy happiness, but on the much stronger foundation of choosing each other even when choosing each other was hard. And maybe, just maybe, that was what it meant to be watched over by something bigger than ourselves, something that believed in the possibility of resurrection even when we'd forgotten how to believe in it ourselves. Something that whispered, "Not yet," when we were ready to quit. That sent unexpected text messages when we needed reminders that courage was possible. That orchestrated dinners and conversations and second chances when we were brave enough to accept them. "We're not finished here," I thought, as I finally drifted off to sleep beside my wife, my hand eventually finding hers in the darkness, our fingers interlacing with the tentative hope of people who were learning how to hold on to each other all over again. We're just beginning. The weeks following our tentative reconciliation dinner felt like living in a carefully controlled experiment, both of us moving with the deliberate caution of people who'd almost lost everything and weren't quite sure how to hold on to what we'd managed to salvage. We were talking again, eating meals together, sleeping in the same bed. But there was a fragility to our renewed connection that made every interaction feel significant. Every conversation feel like it could either build something stronger or shatter what little progress we'd made. I found myself studying Sarah's face during these ordinary moments, trying to read her expressions for signs of regret or hope, watching for clues about whether she was genuinely invested in rebuilding what we'd almost destroyed, or just going through the motions because divorce seemed more terrifying than continuing to coexist in careful politeness. She seemed to be doing the same thing, both of us hyper-aware of each other's moods and reactions in a way that felt both intimate and exhausting. The truth was, we'd both been living with a kind of emotional anesthesia for so long that feeling anything again, even tentative hope, was overwhelming. For months, maybe years, we'd been numbing ourselves to the pain of our deteriorating relationship by staying busy, avoiding difficult conversations, choosing individual activities over shared experiences. It had been easier to feel nothing than to feel the constant ache of loving someone who felt like a stranger, easier to accept the gradual deadening of our connection than to face the possibility that we might not be compatible after all. But anesthesia, I was learning, was a double-edged sword. It protected you from pain, but it also cut you off from joy, from intimacy, from the full spectrum of human experience that made marriage worth having in the first place. We'd been so successful at protecting ourselves from further hurt that we'd forgotten how to be vulnerable with each other, how to risk disappointment for the possibility of genuine connection, how to love each other with the kind of openness that made love worth the inevitable pain it sometimes brought. Now, as we tentatively tried to rebuild intimacy we'd lost, I was discovering how much work it took to feel again, how exhausting it was to care about someone's happiness when you'd trained yourself to focus only on your own emotional survival. Sarah would share something about her day, and I'd find myself calculating the appropriate level of interest to show rather than spontaneously responding with genuine curiosity about her experiences. She'd reach for my hand while we watched television, and I'd have to consciously override the instinct to pull away that had become automatic during our months of careful distance. It felt like learning a foreign language we'd once been fluent in, struggling to remember the vocabulary of love and affection and partnership that had once felt as natural as breathing. The simplest gestures, asking about each other's dreams, sharing random thoughts, offering comfort during stressful days, required conscious effort now, deliberate choices to engage rather than retreat, to connect rather than protect ourselves from the possibility of being hurt or disappointed or taken for granted again. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see whether this fragile peace we'd negotiated would hold, or whether we'd slide back into the Cold War that had become our default mode of existence. Rooms that had felt heavy with tension for months now felt cautiously optimistic, as if the walls themselves were hoping we'd remember how to be happy here, how to fill these spaces with laughter and conversation and the easy intimacy of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. But beneath our careful optimism, I could feel the presence of all the wounds we hadn't addressed, all the resentments we'd accumulated, all the ways we'd hurt each other during our slow drift toward separation. They were like landmines buried just beneath the surface of our renewed politeness, waiting to explode if we stepped wrong, if we pushed too hard too fast, if we tried to pretend that good intentions could substitute for the hard work of actually healing the damage we'd done to each other over years of gradual neglect and increasing emotional distance. We were both trying so hard to be good to each other, to prove that this second chance was worth taking, that our interactions felt almost performative sometimes, like we were playing the roles of people who loved each other, rather than actually being people who loved each other. I'd catch myself rehearsing conversations before having them, choosing words carefully to avoid triggers I'd learned to recognize during our months of conflict, editing my natural responses to fit the version of myself I thought would be easier for Sarah to love. She seemed to be doing the same thing, and sometimes our dinner conversations felt like diplomatic negotiations between two countries that had recently signed a peace treaty but weren't quite ready to trust each other with anything more substantial than trade agreements and cultural exchanges. We discussed safe topics, work, weather, plans for the weekend, with the enthusiasm of people who were genuinely trying to find common ground, but weren't quite ready to venture into the emotional territory where real intimacy lived. Excavating the timeline. 3 weeks into our tentative reconciliation, I started having dreams about our early years together. Vivid scenes from a time when loving each other had felt effortless and natural and full of possibility. I'd wake up with a strange mixture of nostalgia and grief, mourning the loss of people we'd been before life had worn us down, before we'd learned to protect ourselves from each other instead of protecting each other from the world. One Saturday morning, while Sarah was at her book club and I had the house to myself, I found myself digging through old photo albums and boxes of mementos we'd stored in the guest room closet, conducting what felt like an archaeological expedition through the layers of our shared history. I was looking for clues, evidence of when things had started to go wrong, hoping to identify the moment when we'd stopped being allies and started being adversaries. The wedding photos were painful to look at, not because they brought back bad memories, but because they brought back such good ones. We looked so young, so confident, so absolutely certain that love would be enough to carry us through whatever challenges life might bring. Sarah's smile in those pictures was radiant with joy and anticipation, and my face showed the kind of happiness that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, with exactly the right person. The photos from our first apartment told a story of domestic bliss and shared adventures, Sarah painting the kitchen while I assembled furniture, both of us laughing at something I couldn't remember but that had obviously struck us as hilarious at the time. There were pictures of dinner parties we'd hosted, hiking trips we'd taken, lazy Sunday mornings when we'd stayed in bed until noon just because we could, just because being together was more interesting than whatever else the world had to offer. The timeline of our deterioration was subtle but unmistakable once I started looking for it. The photos from our third year of marriage showed us still happy but slightly more formal, posed rather than candid, smiling for the camera rather than because we couldn't help ourselves. By year 5, we appeared in fewer photos together, and when we did, there was often visible space between us, as if we'd started instinctively maintaining physical distance even during moments that were supposed to be celebrations of our togetherness. The box of cards and letters we'd written to each other during our early years was particularly devastating. Sarah's handwriting filled pages and pages with declarations of love and gratitude, detailed descriptions of why she felt lucky to be married to me, specific observations about my character and personality that made her excited about growing old together. My own letters were equally effusive, full of promises about the life we'd build and the adventures we'd share and the ways I planned to love her more completely every year we were together. When had we stopped writing each other letters? When had we stopped noticing specific things about each other that we wanted to celebrate and acknowledge? When had we started taking each other's presence for granted instead of treating it like the gift it had once felt like? I found the card Sarah had given me on our 5th anniversary, the last time she'd written anything longer than "Happy Birthday" or "Happy Anniversary," followed by her signature. In careful script, she'd written, "5 years ago, I married my best friend. And somehow, you've become an even better friend with every year that passes. Thank you for making me laugh every day, for supporting my dreams, even when they seem impossible, for loving me in ways that make me feel beautiful and smart and capable of anything. I can't wait to see what adventures the next 5 years bring." The next 5 years had brought infertility struggles, financial stress, career pressures, family drama, and the gradual erosion of everything she'd celebrated in that anniversary card. We'd stopped being best friends and started being people who shared responsibilities. I'd stopped making her laugh and started annoying her with habits she'd once found endearing. She'd stopped feeling beautiful and smart and capable, and I'd stopped being the kind of husband who made her feel those things about herself. But what struck me most about reading our old correspondence wasn't just how much we'd lost, but how much we'd once had. The love documented in these letters and cards wasn't naive or unrealistic. It was specific and observant and based on deep knowledge of each other's strengths and weaknesses and quirks. We'd really known each other once, really paid attention to each other's inner lives, really invested in each other's happiness in ways that went far beyond the basic obligations of marriage. The deterioration hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been caused by any single catastrophic event. Instead, it had been death by 1,000 small cuts, missed opportunities for connection, conversations that got postponed and then forgotten, moments when we'd chosen individual comfort over shared intimacy, times when we'd been too tired or stressed or distracted to give each other the attention our relationship needed to thrive. As I continued my archaeological dig through our shared history, I started noticing patterns that extended beyond just Sarah and me, connecting our struggles to larger family narratives that neither of us had fully understood or addressed. My parents had divorced when I was 12 after years of increasingly bitter arguments about money and responsibility and whose fault it was that they'd grown apart. Sarah's parents had stayed married, but their relationship had always struck me as more like a business partnership than a love story, efficient and functional, but lacking the warmth and intimacy that I'd assumed all good marriages contained. Looking back, I could see how both of our family histories had shaped our expectations about marriage in ways we'd never fully discussed or even consciously recognized. From my parents, I'd learned that love was fragile and temporary, that marriages required constant vigilance to prevent them from deteriorating into the kind of toxic battlefield my childhood home had become before my father finally moved out. From Sarah's parents, she'd absorbed the idea that marriage was primarily about practical compatibility, shared goals, complementary skills, mutual respect, rather than the deeper emotional and spiritual connection that kept couples united even when practical life became difficult. Neither of us had grown up with models of what it looked like to fight for a marriage when it was struggling, how to rebuild intimacy after it had been damaged, how to love each other through the inevitable seasons of difficulty that every long-term relationship would face. We'd both assumed that if our marriage required serious work, it meant we'd chosen the wrong person or were fundamentally incompatible, rather than understanding that all marriages required ongoing investment and intentional effort to remain vibrant and connected. My father had been emotionally distant even before the divorce, more comfortable expressing love through providing financial security than through emotional availability or physical affection. I could see now how I'd unconsciously replicated that pattern, thinking that working long hours and earning money and handling practical responsibilities was how men showed love, not understanding that Sarah needed emotional intimacy and genuine friendship as much as she needed financial stability and household maintenance. Sarah's mother had been the family peacekeeper, smoothing over conflicts rather than addressing them directly, maintaining harmony at the expense of honest communication about difficult topics. Sarah had learned those same skills, becoming expert at managing tension rather than resolving it, at accommodating rather than advocating for her own needs, at keeping the peace even when peace came at the cost of genuine intimacy and authentic connection. Neither of us had learned how to have productive conflicts, how to disagree without attacking each other's character, how to express disappointment without withdrawing emotionally, how to ask for what we needed without feeling like we were being demanding or unreasonable. We'd both grown up in families where problems were either ignored until they exploded or addressed through blame and criticism rather than curiosity and collaboration. The failure of my parents' marriage had left me terrified of becoming my father, emotionally unavailable, focused on work to the exclusion of relationship, unable to provide the kind of emotional support that women needed from their partners. But in trying so hard not to repeat his mistakes, I'd overcorrected in ways that had created different but equally damaging problems. I'd become so worried about being emotionally distant that I'd sometimes overwhelmed Sarah with intensity she wasn't ready for, pushing for deeper conversations when she needed space, trying to force emotional connection rather than creating the conditions where it could develop naturally. Sarah's determination not to replicate her parents' cold but functional marriage had led her to expect levels of passion and romance that were probably unrealistic for a long-term relationship, especially during periods of stress or transition. When our marriage had started feeling more like a partnership than a love affair, she'd interpreted that as evidence that we weren't meant to be together, rather than understanding that even the best marriages go through seasons of different emotional temperatures. We'd both brought unrealistic expectations and unhealed wounds from our families of origin into our marriage, but we'd never talked about these influences explicitly, never compared notes about what we'd learned about love and commitment and conflict from watching our parents navigate their own relationships. We'd assumed that love would be enough to overcome whatever baggage we'd inherited, that good intentions would automatically translate into healthy patterns, that we could create the kind of marriage we wanted without doing the difficult work of understanding and healing the parts of ourselves that had been shaped by less than perfect examples. It was during this period of historical excavation and pattern recognition that I started noticing what could only be described as divine coincidences, small moments of synchronicity that felt too meaningful to be entirely random, but too subtle to be obviously miraculous. They began showing up in ways that seemed designed to capture my attention without overwhelming my skepticism, gentle nudges toward spiritual awareness that respected my natural tendency to look for rational explanations while still inviting me to consider the possibility that something larger than coincidence was at work. The first one happened during my lunch break on a Tuesday when I decided to walk to the coffee shop down the street instead of eating at my desk like I usually did. The place was crowded, and I ended up standing behind an elderly couple who were discussing their marriage in voices loud enough for me to overhear without intentionally eavesdropping. The man was telling his wife about a difficult period they'd gone through early in their marriage, when they'd almost divorced, but decided to try counseling instead. 53 years later, he said, squeezing her hand while they waited for their order, and I can't imagine being married to anyone else. But we had to learn how to fight for each other instead of against each other. Took us a few years to figure that out. His wife nodded and said, "The pastor told us that marriage wasn't just about finding the right person, it was about becoming the right person for each other." That stuck with me. I stood there listening to this random conversation between strangers, feeling like I was receiving a personal message about exactly what Sarah and I were struggling with. The timing felt too perfect, too relevant to my specific situation to be purely coincidental. These weren't young newlyweds speaking in romantic abstractions. They were people who'd actually survived the kind of crisis Sarah and I were facing and come out stronger on the other side. When I got back to the office, I found an email in my inbox from my college roommate, someone I hadn't heard from in over a year. The subject line was "random question," and the message said he'd been thinking about me and wondered how my marriage was going, mentioning that he and his wife had recently worked through some difficulties with the help of a counselor and wanted to recommend the experience if Sarah and I were ever interested in that kind of support. The coincidence of receiving marriage advice from strangers and then an email about marriage counseling from an old friend within the same hour felt like more than just random timing. It felt like the universe, or God, or whatever force might be paying attention to the details of individual human lives, was trying to tell me something important about the resources that were available if I was willing to ask for help. That evening, while Sarah and I were making dinner together in our tentative new spirit of cooperation, she mentioned that her sister had called during lunch to talk about some problems she was having with her husband. She asked me how we make it work, Sarah said, stirring pasta sauce with more concentration than the task required. I didn't know what to tell her. I mean, we're barely making it work ourselves. "What did you say?" I asked, genuinely curious about how she'd described our relationship to someone else, how she'd explained our current situation to a family member who'd probably assumed we were still the happily married couple we'd appeared to be at family gatherings. "I told her we were figuring it out as we went along," Sarah said, "that we'd had some rough patches but we were working on things. She said something interesting though. She said her pastor had told her that the couples who stay married aren't necessarily the ones who never have problems. They're the ones who decide their marriage is worth fighting for when problems come up." I paused in the middle of chopping vegetables, struck by how similar this was to what I'd overheard at the coffee shop just a few hours earlier. Different words, different people, but essentially the same message about marriage requiring intentional effort and the conscious choice to fight for each other rather than against each other. "Maybe we should think about getting some help," I said, surprised to hear myself suggesting something I'd always associated with couples who were more broken than we were. couples who lacked the basic skills or compatibility necessary to work things out on their own. Sarah looked up from her stirring, and I could see something shift in her expression. Relief, maybe, or hope that someone else might be able to offer guidance we couldn't provide for ourselves. "I've been thinking the same thing," she admitted. "I love you, and I want this to work, but I don't think we know how to fix this by ourselves." That night, after we'd eaten dinner and cleaned the kitchen and settled into our careful routine of parallel evening activities, I found myself thinking about the series of coincidences that had led to our conversation about counseling. Individually, each event could be explained away. Overheard conversations, random emails, family phone calls were all normal parts of daily life. But together, they felt like breadcrumbs leading toward a path we might not have discovered on our own. I'd received another one of those mysterious text messages earlier in the week, this one from Isaiah 49:16. "See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands." I'd deleted it just like the others, but the words had stayed with me, especially the image of being engraved rather than just written down. Permanently marked, impossible to erase or forget, held in the most intimate way possible. The idea that God might have Sarah and me engraved on his hands, that our marriage might be permanently inscribed in divine attention and care, felt both comforting and overwhelming. If that were true, it would mean our struggles weren't evidence of divine abandonment, but rather proof that something larger than ourselves was invested in our success, was working behind the scenes to provide the help and guidance we needed to heal what we'd broken. Resistance and first crack of hope. But even as part of me was beginning to recognize what looked like divine intervention in the practical details of our reconciliation, another part of me was resistant to spiritual explanations for what felt like very human problems. Sarah and I had created this mess through our own choices and neglect and failure to prioritize our relationship appropriately. Why should we expect God to fix what we'd broken through our own selfishness and short-sightedness? The rational part of my mind insisted that the coincidences I was noticing were just examples of confirmation bias, that I was looking for spiritual significance in random events because I desperately wanted to believe that our marriage was worth saving and that help was available if we were humble enough to accept it. People got divorced every day without any dramatic divine interventions, and plenty of marriages ended despite years of prayer and good intentions and earnest efforts to make things work. What made me think Sarah and I were special enough to warrant supernatural assistance? What made our love story more deserving of miraculous preservation than the millions of other relationships that had started with hope and ended in disappointment despite everyone's best efforts? But my resistance to spiritual explanations was competing with a growing sense that something was shifting in my heart, some gradual softening toward the possibility that I didn't have to figure everything out on my own, that admitting I needed help wasn't the same as admitting failure. The text messages, the overheard conversations, the perfectly timed phone calls, they were creating a pattern that felt like an invitation to trust in something larger than my own limited ability to analyze and solve problems. Maybe faith wasn't about having all the answers or understanding exactly how divine intervention worked in the practical details of human relationships. Maybe it was about being willing to accept help when it was offered, being open to guidance even when it came in forms I didn't expect, or through sources I wouldn't have chosen. That Sunday, for the first time in months, I suggested that Sarah and I attend church together. We'd both grown up going to church, had even been married in a church, but our attendance had become sporadic over the years, limited mostly to holidays and special occasions when family expectations made it easier to show up than to explain why we weren't there. Sarah looked surprised but pleased by the suggestion, and we spent Saturday evening looking online for churches in our area, reading about different denominations and worship styles, and trying to find a place that might feel welcoming to two people who weren't sure what they believed about God, but were pretty sure they needed help with their marriage. We settled on a non-denominational church about 15 minutes from our house, one that advertised itself as a place for people with questions and doubts rather than just people with firm convictions and unshakable faith. The website mentioned marriage ministries and small groups and counseling services, all of which sounded like resources we might eventually be brave enough to investigate. Sunday morning felt strange and hopeful as we got dressed for church together, choosing clothes that seemed appropriate for worship, but not so formal that we'd feel like we were pretending to be more religious than we actually were. The church building was modern but warm, filled with people who looked normal rather than saintly, families with crying babies and teenagers who clearly didn't want to be there, and couples who looked like they might be working through their own relationship challenges. The sermon was about forgiveness, not the easy kind that happened automatically when someone apologized sincerely, but the difficult kind that required choosing to release resentment even when the hurt was justified, even when the other person hadn't fully earned trust back yet. The pastor spoke about forgiveness as a process rather than a one-time event, something that had to be chosen repeatedly until it became a habit, a way of loving that protected relationships from being destroyed by the inevitable disappointments and failures that all human connections included. As I sat there listening to words about grace and second chances and the possibility of healing what seemed beyond repair, I felt something loosening in my chest, some knot of anger and disappointment that had been choking off my ability to hope for better days ahead. I looked over at Sarah and saw that she was crying quietly, tears running down her cheeks as she listened to someone talk about the kind of love that persisted even when it wasn't easy, even when it required more from us than we thought we had to give. After the service, we sat in our car for a long time before driving home, both of us processing what we'd heard, both of us afraid to say too much too soon, but also afraid to let the moment pass without acknowledging that something significant had happened during that hour of shared listening. "I want to try," Sarah said finally, her voice soft but clear. "I want to try to forgive you for the ways you've hurt me. And I want you to try to forgive me too. I want to see if we can learn how to love each other better than we have been." I reached for her hand, and she let me take it, and we sat there in the church parking lot, holding hands like teenagers, like people who were just beginning to fall in love, instead of people who were trying to remember how to love each other after almost forgetting entirely. "I want to try too," I said, and for the first time in months, it felt like we were really on the same team again, really committed to fighting for each other instead of against each other. Maybe this is what it looks like, I thought, as we finally drove home together, when God watches over people who are ready to admit they need help. Maybe this is how miracles happen, not all at once, but gradually through a series of small coincidences and gentle invitations and moments when wounded people choose hope over despair. Maybe we're not finished here after all. Maybe we're just getting started on the real work of learning how to be married to each other. The breakthrough came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night in November, during one of those sleepless hours when the darkness felt heavy enough to suffocate hope itself. Sarah was sleeping peacefully beside me, finally able to rest without the tension that had kept us both awake for months. But I lay there staring at the ceiling with my heart racing and my mind churning through every conversation we'd had since our tentative reconciliation began. We'd been attending church for 6 weeks, had started seeing a marriage counselor named Dr. Martinez, who specialized in helping couples rebuild trust and intimacy, had been doing the homework assignment she gave us about expressing appreciation and practicing active listening. On paper, we were making progress. In practice, I felt like I was drowning in the effort required to love someone when love felt more like work than joy, more like obligation than privilege. The problem wasn't that I didn't love Sarah. I did, desperately, with a fierceness that surprised me every time I really stopped to examine it. The problem was that I felt like I was failing at loving her well. Like every attempt I made to be the husband she needed was clumsy and inadequate and somehow missing the mark. I'd apologize for years of emotional distance, and she'd forgive me, but I could see in her eyes that forgiveness wasn't the same as trust. That saying sorry wasn't the same as becoming the kind of man who wouldn't need to apologize for the same things over and over again. I slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake her, and made my way downstairs to the kitchen where this whole crisis had started, with a broken plate and broken promises, and the realization that we'd been living like strangers for longer than either of us wanted to admit. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a police siren somewhere in the neighborhood, and I found myself standing at the kitchen counter in my pajamas, looking around at the space where we'd shared so many meals and arguments and tentative reconciliations. And then, without planning it or thinking about it or deciding it was a good idea, I started talking to God. Not praying exactly, not in any formal way I'd learned in Sunday school or church services, but talking, raw, honest, angry, talking that came from a place deeper than politeness or theological correctness. "I don't know what you want from me," I said out loud to the empty kitchen, my voice harsh in the silence. "I'm trying here. I'm really trying. I go to church. I read the books the counselor recommends. I apologize for things I didn't even know I was doing wrong. I'm doing everything I can think of to save this marriage, and it still feels like I'm failing." The words came faster then, all the frustration and fear and desperate confusion I'd been carrying for months pouring out in a stream of accusations and questions that felt dangerous and necessary at the same time. You let me believe in forever when I married her. You were there. I felt you there when we said our vows, when we promised to love each other until death parted us. Where were you when we started dying to each other? Where were you when every conversation became a fight, when every touch felt forced, when we stopped being friends and started being enemies? I was pacing now, moving around the kitchen like a caged animal, my voice getting louder as 13 years of unexpressed spiritual anger finally found its way to the surface. I gave you my marriage at the altar. I asked you to bless it, to protect it, to help us love each other the way you love us. And you let it fall apart anyway. You watched us hurt each other, watched us give up on each other, watched us come so close to destroying everything we'd built together. The anger felt good in a terrible way, like lancing an infected wound that had been poisoning my system for years. I'd been so focused on being grateful and faithful and appropriately humble in my spiritual life that I'd never allowed myself to be honestly furious with God for the ways life had disappointed me, for the gap between what I'd expected marriage to feel like and what it had actually become. "Why didn't you fix this before it got so broken?" I demanded, surprising myself with the intensity of my rage. "Why didn't you change my heart when I started taking her for granted? Why didn't you change her heart when she started pulling away from me? Why didn't you send us help before we almost destroyed everything?" I stood there in the kitchen, breathing hard, waiting for something, lightning or peace or an audible voice, or at least some kind of sign that my questions had been heard and would be answered. Instead, there was just silence, the same silence that had been God's response to most of my prayers during the darkest months of our marriage crisis. But then, gradually, I became aware of something shifting in the quality of that silence. It didn't feel empty anymore, didn't feel like abandonment or indifference. It felt full, pregnant with presence, like the silence of someone who was listening so intently that they didn't want to interrupt with premature responses. and into that silence came a whisper so quiet I almost missed it, so gentle I might have dismissed it as imagination if it hadn't felt more real than my own thoughts. I was here. I was here at the altar. I am here now. I have never left. The whisper should have been comforting, but instead it made me angrier, because if God had really been present during all our months of misery and conflict, why hadn't he done something more dramatic to help us? Why hadn't he changed our hearts or circumstances or given us some kind of divine intervention that would have prevented us from coming so close to losing everything? "That's not enough," I said, my voice cracking with emotion I hadn't known I was carrying. "Being here isn't enough if you're not going to actually help. What good is divine presence if it doesn't change anything, if it doesn't make love easier, or marriage less difficult, or people less capable of hurting each other?" I thought about all the prayers I'd prayed over the years, for our relationship, for wisdom, for patience, for the ability to love Sarah the way she deserved to be loved. I thought about all the sermons I'd heard about God answering prayers and providing for his children and working all things together for good. Where was the evidence of any of that in our near divorce, in our months of sleeping in separate rooms, in our careful conversations that felt more like hostage negotiations than intimate exchanges between people who'd promised to cherish each other? "I did everything I was supposed to do," I continued, my voice getting louder again as I worked myself back up to full righteous indignation. "I married a Christian woman in a church ceremony. I tried to be faithful and responsible and committed. I worked hard to provide for us. I never cheated. I never abused her. I showed up for our life together even when showing up felt impossible." The list of my marital virtues felt pathetic even as I recited it, because I knew that doing the minimum requirements of not being a terrible husband wasn't the same as being a great husband, wasn't the same as creating the kind of marriage that would make Sarah feel loved and valued and excited about growing old together. "But it wasn't enough, was it?" I asked, and now my voice was quieter, more defeated than angry. Being a decent guy wasn't enough. Not cheating wasn't enough. Paying the bills and showing up wasn't enough. She needed more from me, and I didn't know how to give it to her, and you just watched me fail over and over again without helping me figure out how to love her better. This was the core of my spiritual anger, I realized. Not just that God had allowed our marriage to almost fail, but that he'd allowed me to be the kind of husband who could hurt someone I loved so much without even realizing I was doing it. I'd wanted to be Sarah's protector and provider and partner, but somehow I'd become the source of her loneliness and disappointment and doubt about whether she'd chosen the right person to spend her life with. "Why didn't you change me?" I demanded, tears starting to run down my face now as the anger gave way to grief. "Why didn't you make me the man she needed me to be? Why didn't you teach me how to pay attention to her feelings, how to make her feel beautiful and appreciated and loved? Why did you let me be so clueless about what marriage required, so selfish about my own needs that I forgot to care about hers?" The questions felt blasphemous and necessary at the same time, like breaking some kind of religious rule about maintaining proper reverence toward God while simultaneously accessing a level of honesty I'd never allowed myself before. I'd spent years being grateful and accepting and appropriately submissive in my spiritual life, but I'd never been authentically angry, never demanded explanations for the ways divine love had seemed absent or insufficient during the times I'd needed it most. "She's a good woman," I said, my voice breaking as I thought about Sarah sleeping upstairs, about all the ways she'd tried to love me despite my emotional limitations, about how patient she'd been with my learning curve, before finally reaching the point where patience felt like enabling rather than loving. She deserves better than me. She deserves a husband who knows how to cherish her without having to learn how from a marriage counselor. She deserves someone who makes her feel beautiful and desired and appreciated every day. not someone who takes her for granted until she's so tired of being taken for granted that she starts planning her escape. This was my deepest fear, the accusation I'd never been willing to voice even to myself, that maybe Sarah really did deserve better than me, that maybe our marriage problems weren't just about poor communication or unmet expectations, but about a fundamental mismatch between the kind of woman she was and the kind of man I was capable of being. "If you love her," I whispered, "if you really care about her happiness, maybe you should let her go. Maybe you should help her find someone who won't need years of therapy and counseling and spiritual transformation just to figure out how to love her well. Maybe the most loving thing I could do would be to sign those divorce papers and set her free to find someone who's actually good at being married." The thought of losing her, of watching her build a life with someone else who might be naturally gifted at the things I had to work so hard to learn, made me feel sick to my stomach. But it also felt like the most honest prayer I'd ever prayed. The first time I'd been willing to put Sarah's happiness ahead of my own desperate need to keep her in my life, regardless of whether I was actually capable of making her happy. After I'd exhausted myself with accusations and demands and self-recriminations, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at a face I barely recognized. I looked older than I felt, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, marked by months of stress and uncertainty and the constant effort of trying to become a better person than I'd ever been before. But as I studied my reflection in the harsh fluorescent light, I started to see something I'd been avoiding for years. Not just the ways Sarah had hurt or disappointed me, not just the ways our marriage had failed to meet my expectations, but the ways I had contributed to our problems through my own selfishness and emotional immaturity and stubborn refusal to acknowledge that love required more than good intentions. I thought about the conversation we'd had the week before with Dr. Martinez when she'd asked us each to describe what we needed from the other person in order to feel loved and valued in our marriage. Sarah's list had been specific and heartbreaking. She needed me to ask about her feelings and remember her answers, to notice when she was stressed or sad without waiting for her to explicitly ask for support, to express physical affection that wasn't just a prelude to sex, to show interest in her thoughts and dreams and daily experiences because I genuinely wanted to know about her inner life. My list had been vaguer and more focused on what I didn't want her to do. I didn't want her to criticize my efforts to improve, didn't want her to bring up past mistakes during current disagreements, didn't want her to withdraw emotionally when she was upset instead of telling me directly what was wrong. The difference between our lists had been revealing in ways that made me uncomfortable. Sarah was asking for more connection, more attention, more evidence that I found her interesting and valuable as a person. I was asking for less conflict, less pressure, less emotional intensity that felt overwhelming and confusing. She wanted me to move toward her. I wanted her to make it easier for me to stay where I was. Standing in the bathroom mirror, I could see how that dynamic had played out over years of marriage. Sarah reaching out for deeper intimacy, and me either missing her bids for connection entirely or feeling overwhelmed by them and pulling back, which made her reach out more desperately, which made me pull back more defensively, until we were locked in a cycle of pursuit and withdrawal that left both of us feeling misunderstood and unloved. But I could also see, for the first time with real clarity, that my withdrawal hadn't been malicious or intentional. I'd been scared of not being enough for her, scared of failing to meet needs I didn't understand, scared of the vulnerability that real intimacy required and that felt dangerous to someone who'd grown up in a family where emotional openness was often punished with criticism or abandonment. I'd learned to protect myself by staying surface level in my relationships, by being pleasant and agreeable and helpful without ever revealing too much about my inner world or asking too much about anyone else's. It had worked fine for friendships and work relationships and casual social interactions, But marriage required a level of emotional nakedness that terrified me, especially with someone whose opinion mattered so much that her approval or disappointment could determine whether I felt like a success or failure as a human being. The person I was looking at in the mirror wasn't a villain or a victim. He was just scared of being truly known and found wanting, scared of loving someone so much that losing them would feel like dying, scared of the responsibility that came with being someone's primary source of emotional security and support. But being scared wasn't the same as being incapable of growth. Being scared didn't mean I was doomed to repeat the same patterns forever. Didn't mean I couldn't learn how to love Sarah in ways that made her feel cherished instead of tolerated. Maybe the problem wasn't that I was the wrong person for her. Maybe the problem was that I'd been trying to love her while protecting myself from the risk of really loving her, trying to be married while avoiding the vulnerability that marriage required. "I'm scared," I said to my reflection, and it felt like the first completely honest thing I'd said all night. I'm scared of needing her so much, scared of her leaving me, scared of not being enough for her, scared of messing this up again, even after we've worked so hard to put it back together. But as I said the words, I realized something else. I was more scared of losing her than I was of the vulnerability required to keep her. I was more scared of living without her than I was of doing the hard work of learning how to live with her in ways that made both of us happy. The reflection looking back at me wasn't the face of a man who was incapable of change. It was the face of someone who'd been operating from fear for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to operate from love. Someone who'd been so focused on protecting himself that he'd forgotten to protect the relationship that mattered more than his own comfort. As I stood there confronting my own face and the fear that had been driving so many of my choices, I felt something shift in the atmosphere around me. It was subtle at first, like the change in air pressure that happens before a storm, but gradually it became more pronounced, more undeniable, like a presence filling the small bathroom space with warmth and weight, and the kind of attention that makes you aware you're being seen completely. And then I heard it again, not the whisper from earlier, but something stronger, more distinct, like a voice speaking directly into my consciousness without using my ears. "Fear is not your master anymore." The words hit me with physical force, and I gripped the edge of the bathroom sink to steady myself as something fundamental shifted inside my chest, like a lock being turned, or a dam being opened, or a wall that had stood for years suddenly cracking down the middle. "I was at your wedding," the voice continued, and I could hear love in it now, not the conditional love I'd always imagined God having for people who got their lives together, but the fierce, protective, unconditional love of someone who had been watching over me even when I'd felt most alone. "I am in your kitchen. I am in your silence. I am in your fear, and I am in your courage to love despite your fear." I started crying then, not the angry tears I'd shed earlier, but something deeper, something that felt like relief and gratitude, and the overwhelming realization that I had never been as alone as I'd believed. Even during the worst moments of our marriage crisis, even when I'd felt like I was drowning in my own inadequacy and Sarah's disappointment, something had been holding on to me, believing in possibilities I couldn't see. "Your marriage isn't failing me," the voice said, and I could hear infinite patience in the words, infinite compassion for the ways I'd tortured myself with guilt and self-recrimination and the belief that I was somehow beyond redemption. "You're not failing me." This was the revelation that broke me completely. Not that I was a terrible husband who needed to try harder, but that I was a beloved son who was learning how to love, making mistakes, but still held, still cherished, still believed in, even when I couldn't believe in myself. "I have been waiting for you to stop trying to earn love and start receiving it," the voice continued, and I understood suddenly that this was the core issue that had infected not just my marriage, but my entire relationship with love itself. I'd been trying to deserve Sarah's love through good behavior and perfect performance, trying to earn God's love through spiritual disciplines and moral improvement, never understanding that love, real love, the kind that transforms people from the inside out, couldn't be earned or lost, but only received as gift. "Receive my love for you first," the voice said, and I felt something warm and healing flow through my chest like medicine for wounds I didn't even know I was carrying. Then love her from that fullness, not from your emptiness. I stood there in our bathroom, tears streaming down my face, feeling like I was being rebuilt from the foundation up. All my efforts to love Sarah better had been coming from a place of desperate need, my need to be accepted, to be approved of, to be enough for someone whose opinion determined my worth. But love that came from neediness was always conditional, always self-serving, always vulnerable to collapse when the other person couldn't meet those needs. Love that came from fullness, from knowing I was already loved beyond measure by the one who had created love itself, would be different. It would be generous instead of grasping, confident instead of anxious, secure enough to risk vulnerability because it wouldn't be dependent on Sarah's response for its validity. "You are already enough," the voice said, and the words went deeper than intellectual understanding, deeper than positive thinking or self-help affirmations, all the way down to the cellular level where fear had been living for so many years. "You are already chosen, already beloved, already held." Love her from that knowledge, not from the fear of losing what you've never actually possessed. The bathroom mirror reflected a different man now, not someone who'd figured out all the answers or become perfect overnight, but someone who'd been given permission to stop trying to earn what had already been freely given. Someone who'd been invited to love from abundance instead of scarcity. Over the following days, I found myself moving through the world with a different sense of who I was and what I was capable of. The encounter in the bathroom hadn't magically solved all our marriage problems or transformed me into the perfect husband overnight, but it had shifted something fundamental about how I understood my identity and my worth and my capacity to love Sarah well. For years, I'd been operating from the belief that I was fundamentally flawed, that my value as a person was determined by how well I performed in my various roles: husband, employee, son, friend. When I succeeded at making Sarah happy, I felt good about myself. When I disappointed her, or hurt her feelings, or failed to meet her needs, I felt like a failure as a human being. But the voice in the bathroom had spoken a different truth, that my worth wasn't determined by my performance, but by my identity as someone beloved by God, someone created with intention and care and infinite hope for who I might become. I was already enough, not because I'd earned enoughness through good behavior, but because enoughness was my birthright as a child of the God who had invented love itself. This shift changed everything about how I approached my relationship with Sarah. Instead of desperately trying to prove I was worthy of her love, I could focus on expressing the love I'd already received. Instead of being paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes, I could risk vulnerability because my value wasn't dependent on her approval. Instead of needing her to complete me or validate me or fix the broken places in my heart, I could offer her a love that was free and generous and secure enough to prioritize her happiness over my own emotional neediness. The practical changes started small but felt revolutionary. When Sarah mentioned feeling stressed about a work deadline, I didn't immediately offer solutions or try to fix her problems. I just listened, asked questions, offered the kind of emotional support she'd been asking for all along, but that I'd been too anxious about my own adequacy to provide. When she looked tired after a long day, I suggested she take a bath while I cleaned the kitchen. Not because I was trying to earn points or prove I was a good husband, but because I genuinely wanted her to feel cared for and appreciated. The difference was subtle but significant. Love that came from security felt different to both give and receive than love that came from desperation. When I stopped needing Sarah to constantly reassure me that I was enough for her, she started naturally expressing more appreciation for the things I did to show love. When I stopped being defensive about past mistakes, she stopped bringing them up in current conversations. When I started asking about her inner world, because I was genuinely curious, rather than because I was supposed to ask, she started sharing more openly about her thoughts and feelings and dreams. Dr. Martinez noticed the change during our next counseling session. "Something's different," she observed, looking back and forth between us. "You both seem more relaxed, more present with each other. What's been happening at home?" I tried to explain about the bathroom encounter without sounding like I'd had some kind of mystical experience that might make me seem unstable or unreliable. "I think I finally understood that I don't have to earn Sarah's love," I said. "I've been trying so hard to be perfect that I forgot to just be myself, forgot to love her from a place of abundance instead of neediness." Sarah nodded, reaching for my hand in a gesture that felt natural rather than forced. "He's been different," she said. "More confident, but also more gentle, more interested in me as a person rather than just trying to make me happy so he can feel good about himself." The way she described the change helped me understand what had really shifted. I'd stopped trying to use our relationship to fix my own insecurities and started using it to express the love I'd discovered I was already full of. Instead of looking to Sarah to complete me, I was learning to love her from the completeness I'd found in knowing I was already complete in God's eyes. This didn't mean our marriage became easy, or that we stopped having conflicts, or that all our problems disappeared overnight. We still had to negotiate differences of opinion, still had to work through years of accumulated hurt and disappointment, still had to learn practical skills about communication and conflict resolution and maintaining intimacy over the long haul. But the foundation was different now. Instead of two incomplete people desperately trying to find wholeness in each other, we were becoming two whole people choosing to share our lives together. Instead of love being a scarce resource we had to fight over, it was becoming an abundant gift we could offer freely because we knew the source would never run dry. The Bible verse text messages stopped coming, but I didn't need them anymore. The voice I'd heard in the bathroom had become an internal compass, a constant reminder that I was loved and chosen and capable of loving others from that security. The divine watching I'd once experienced as judgment or pressure had become a comforting presence, like being held by someone strong enough to carry whatever weight I couldn't manage on my own. Sarah started sleeping more peacefully, laughing more often, reaching for my hand during movies, asking my opinion about things that mattered to her. The woman I'd married was still there, had always been there. But she'd been buried under years of disappointment and self-protection and the exhaustion of trying to love someone who couldn't receive love freely. Now that I was learning to receive love from God, from her, from the community we were building at church and in counseling, I was also learning to give it more generously, more consistently, more joyfully. Love wasn't work anymore. It was worship, a natural overflow of gratitude for being so loved myself. "We're not finished here," I thought one evening as we cooked dinner together, moving around our kitchen with an ease and affection that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. "We're just beginning to understand what love actually looks like when it's rooted in something stronger than fear." And for the first time since our crisis began, I was genuinely excited to see what came next, confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, we wouldn't have to face them alone. We had each other, we had help, and we had a God who was still watching, not with disappointment or impatience, but with the infinite love of someone who had always believed in the possibility of resurrection, even when we'd forgotten how to believe in it ourselves. 3 months after my bathroom encounter with the divine voice that had shifted everything about how I understood love and identity, I found myself retracing the timeline of our marriage crisis with completely different eyes. What had once looked like evidence of abandonment or divine indifference now revealed itself as an intricate pattern of provision and protection, a careful orchestration of circumstances and encounters designed to save us from ourselves when we'd been too stubborn or scared to ask for help directly. It started with a conversation Sarah and I had over breakfast on a Saturday morning in February, the kind of leisurely weekend meal we'd begun sharing again now that eating together felt like pleasure rather than obligation. She was reading something on her phone and suddenly looked up with an expression of wonder and gratitude that made her face glow with the kind of beauty that had nothing to do with physical appearance and everything to do with joy radiating from the inside out. "Do you remember that night in October when we had the fight about the plumber?" she asked, and I immediately knew she was referring to the kitchen confrontation that had almost ended our marriage, the conversation where we'd both finally admitted we didn't know what we wanted anymore, except that this couldn't continue the way it had been going. "Of course," I said, still able to feel the echo of that evening's desperation whenever I thought about how close we'd come to walking away from everything we'd built together. "I was thinking about what happened right after that," she continued, her voice soft with something that sounded like awe. "How my sister called me the next day to ask about marriage advice, and then your friend Mark sent you that email about counseling. And then we both somehow ended up suggesting therapy at the same time, even though neither of us had ever talked about it before." I paused with my coffee mug halfway to my lips, suddenly seeing the sequence of events she was describing with the kind of clarity that made my skin prickle with recognition. At the time, those coincidences had felt helpful, but not necessarily miraculous. Just the kind of random timing that sometimes worked in your favor when you needed it most. But looking back with the perspective that divine love had been orchestrating our rescue from the beginning, they took on a completely different significance. "And the church thing," Sarah continued, her eyes bright with the excitement of someone who was discovering a treasure map hidden in plain sight. "Do you remember how we both suggested going to church on the same weekend? Even though we hadn't talked about it and neither of us had been particularly religious lately." I did remember, and now that she was pointing it out, I could see how unlikely it was that two people who'd been barely speaking for months would independently arrive at the same spiritual solution to their marital problems. It was as if something had been planting seeds in both our hearts simultaneously, preparing us to reach for help we didn't even know we needed. "It's like..." She paused, searching for words to describe what she was seeing. Like someone was moving pieces around on a chessboard, arranging things so that we'd have exactly what we needed exactly when we needed it, even when we were too proud or too scared to admit we needed anything at all. Her observation launched us into the kind of conversation we used to have during our early years of marriage, when we'd stay up late talking about philosophy and faith and the mysterious ways life seemed to unfold according to patterns too intricate to be purely accidental. But this conversation had an urgency and gratitude that our younger discussions had lacked, the intensity that comes from people who've been rescued from something they hadn't even realized was killing them. We spent the entire morning reconstructing our crisis timeline, looking for fingerprints of divine intervention that we'd missed while we were living through the events themselves. What emerged was a story of such careful provision and perfectly timed interventions that it felt like reading about someone else's life, someone who'd been watched over and protected and guided every step of the way by a love too big to be contained within human understanding. Reframing the story. The first major reframe came when we started talking about what we'd initially seen as our biggest failures, the months when we'd slept in separate rooms, barely spoken to each other, lived like hostile roommates who happened to share a mortgage and a last name. At the time, those months had felt like evidence that our marriage was irreparably broken, that we'd damaged our connection beyond any possibility of repair. But looking back, we could see how that period of separation had actually protected us from saying things that couldn't be unsaid, from making permanent decisions during temporary emotions, from destroying each other in the way that couples sometimes do when they stay in close proximity while working through deep hurt and disappointment. The space between us had felt like rejection, but it had actually been a form of divine mercy, a way of preserving our marriage by preventing us from inflicting additional damage while we were both too wounded to love each other well. I was so angry at you for moving to the guest room, I admitted, remembering how abandoned I'd felt when Sarah had started sleeping separately, how I'd interpreted her need for space as evidence that she'd already given up on us completely. I thought you'd see it as relief, she replied, and I could hear old pain in her voice even though we were both viewing those events through the lens of gratitude now. I thought you'd be happy to have the bed to yourself, to not have to deal with my crying or my insomnia or my constant anxiety about whether we were going to make it. But what we could see now was how her decision to sleep separately had forced both of us to confront what we were actually losing, had made the potential reality of divorce concrete in a way that motivates change rather than enabling continued complacency. Those nights of sleeping alone had been painful, but they'd also been educational, teaching us both what our lives would feel like if we actually followed through on the separation we'd been threatening. I used to lie in that guest room and listen to you moving around the house, Sarah continued, and I'd think about how quiet it would be if you weren't there at all, how empty. I think that's when I started realizing that I didn't actually want you gone. I just wanted us to figure out how to be together without hurting each other so much. The months of careful distance had also given us both time to miss each other in ways that reminded us why we'd fallen in love in the first place. Instead of focusing on what was wrong with our relationship, we'd started remembering what had been right about it, what we'd lost that was worth fighting to recover. Even our biggest fights, the ones that had left us both feeling hopeless about our future together, had served a purpose we hadn't recognized at the time. They'd forced us to say out loud all the grievances and disappointments we'd been carrying in silence, had cleared the air of years of accumulated resentment and unspoken hurt that had been poisoning our connection from underneath. We needed to have those fights, I realized as we talked through some of our worst moments. We needed to get all that anger and disappointment out in the open where we could deal with it instead of letting it keep festering under the surface. Sarah nodded, and I could see that she was thinking about the same thing I was, how much lighter we'd both felt after our kitchen confrontation, even though it had been devastating in the moment. It was like lancing an infected wound that had been making both of us sick, without either of us understanding what was wrong. Even my near miss with the divorce attorney had been a necessary part of the story, a way of forcing me to confront the full reality of what I'd be losing if I actually followed through on ending our marriage. Sitting in that parking lot, imagining the process of legally dissolving everything we'd built together, had clarified for me that I didn't want to be free from Sarah. I wanted to be free to love her better than I'd been able to love her before. I think that's when I finally understood that I wasn't trapped in our marriage, I told her. I was choosing it. Every day, I was choosing you, choosing us, choosing to keep working, even when working felt impossible. As we continued our archaeological dig through the wreckage and reconstruction of our relationship, what became most clear was how our marriage crisis had been the catalyst for both of us rediscovering what it meant to be loved by God in ways that weren't dependent on our performance or behavior or ability to keep our lives perfectly organized. For years, my relationship with God had been primarily transactional. I'd try to be good, and He'd bless my life accordingly. When our marriage started falling apart, despite my best efforts to be a decent husband, I'd felt abandoned and betrayed. Like God had reneged on His part of some cosmic bargain I thought we'd made. But the bathroom encounter had shattered that whole framework, revealing that divine love wasn't something I could earn or lose, but something I could only receive as gift. God's love for me wasn't dependent on whether my marriage succeeded or failed, wasn't diminished by my mistakes or enhanced by my good intentions. It was constant, unconditional, fierce in a way that felt both terrifying and liberating. This revelation had transformed not just how I understood my relationship with God, but how I understood love itself. If divine love could be that unconditional, that generous, that secure in itself, then maybe human love could aspire to something similar. Maybe the love I offered Sarah could be rooted in abundance rather than scarcity, could be generous rather than grasping, could prioritize her well-being over my own emotional neediness. "You're different now when you love me," Sarah observed, and there was wonder in her voice like someone describing a miracle. "It feels less desperate, less like you need me to prove that you're lovable. It feels more like a gift you're giving because you want to, not because you have to in order to feel good about yourself." She was right. Learning to receive divine love had taught me how to give human love in ways that felt sustainable and healthy for both of us. Instead of using our relationship to fix my own insecurities, I was learning to love her from the security of knowing I was already completely loved by the one who had created love itself. Sarah had gone through her own spiritual transformation during our crisis, though hers had been quieter, more gradual than my dramatic bathroom encounter. She'd started praying again during our worst months, not formal prayers, but desperate conversations with God about whether her marriage was worth saving and whether she had the strength to keep trying when trying felt so futile. "I kept asking God to change you," she admitted with a laugh that had embarrassment in it. "I'd pray for you to become more emotionally available, more romantic, more intuitive about what I needed. It took me a while to realize that maybe the person who needed changing was me." Her transformation had been about learning to ask for what she needed directly instead of hoping I'd figure it out through telepathy, about expressing appreciation for the ways I did show love, even when they weren't exactly the ways she preferred to receive it, about choosing trust over self-protection, even when trust felt risky. But more than that, she'd learned to find her primary identity in being God's beloved daughter rather than in being my wife, which had freed her to love me without needing me to complete her or validate her worth as a person. When she stopped needing our marriage to provide her sense of identity and security, she could invest in it more generously, more hopefully, more joyfully. "I think that's why the counseling worked so well for us," she reflected. "We weren't going to therapy as two desperate people trying to save a dying relationship. We were going as two people who were learning to be whole on our own and wanted to figure out how to share that wholeness with each other." The change in both of us had created a positive feedback loop that strengthened our marriage in ways we never could have engineered through willpower or good intentions alone. The more secure I became in divine love, the more freely I could love Sarah. The more freely I loved her, the safer she felt to be vulnerable with me. The more vulnerable she was willing to be, the deeper our intimacy became. The deeper our intimacy, the more both of us experienced marriage as the source of joy and partnership it was meant to be, rather than the source of anxiety and conflict it had become. By spring, gratitude had become our default emotional state, not because our life had become perfect, but because we'd learned to recognize the constant presence of grace in both dramatic interventions and ordinary daily provisions. Every morning felt like waking up to a life we'd been given a second chance to live well. Every shared meal felt like a celebration of being able to enjoy each other's company again. Every peaceful evening felt like a miracle of two people who'd learned how to create harmony instead of constantly generating conflict. And I found myself crying during random moments while washing dishes, while watching Sarah read on the couch, while listening to music in the car on my way to work. Not tears of sadness, but tears of overwhelming gratitude for being allowed to keep the life I'd almost thrown away through my own emotional immaturity and stubborn refusal to ask for help when I'd needed it most. The house itself felt different, lighter somehow, as if the walls had absorbed years of tension and conflict and were now releasing it in favor of something warmer and more welcoming. Rooms that had felt heavy with unspoken resentment now felt spacious and peaceful, filled with the kind of contentment that comes from people who genuinely enjoy being in each other's presence. Our kitchen, the site of so many arguments and broken dishes and desperate conversations, had become my favorite room in the house again. It was where we cooked together on weekend mornings, where we lingered over coffee and conversation, where we'd learned to fight fair when disagreements arose, where we practiced the daily intimacy of two people who were committed to taking care of each other in both practical and emotional ways. I'd started leaving notes for Sarah in unexpected places, tucked into her laptop bag, taped to the bathroom mirror, slipped between the pages of books she was reading. Not romantic poems or elaborate declarations of love, but simple observations about things I noticed and appreciated about her. The way she hummed while doing dishes, how patient she was with her elderly mother during their weekly phone calls, the care she took in choosing birthday gifts for our nieces and nephews. She'd started doing the same thing, and our house became filled with small paper reminders of how much we valued each other's presence in our daily lives. It was like living inside a love letter that we were writing together, one small gesture at a time. Each note a piece of evidence that we were paying attention to each other in ways we'd forgotten how to do during our crisis years. The gratitude extended beyond just our marriage to encompass all the people and circumstances that had conspired to save us from ourselves. Dr. Martinez, who'd helped us learn practical skills for navigating conflict and rebuilding trust. The pastor at our church, whose sermons about forgiveness and grace had given us language for what we were experiencing. Mark, whose perfectly timed email about marriage counseling had planted seeds that grew into the help we'd needed. Sarah's sister, whose phone call about her own marriage struggles had reminded us that we weren't the only couple who had to work to stay connected. Even the strangers who'd crossed our path at crucial moments, the elderly couple in the coffee shop whose conversation about fighting for each other instead of against each other had given me permission to hope that long-term love was possible, the anonymous sender of those Bible verse text messages that had appeared exactly when I'd needed reminders that I wasn't alone in my struggles. "Do you think it was really random?" Sarah asked one evening as we talked about all the perfectly timed interventions that had marked our journey back to each other. All those coincidences, all those moments when exactly the right help showed up exactly when we needed it. I thought about the question seriously, remembering my initial resistance to spiritual explanations for what had felt like very human problems. Part of me would always be inclined toward rational explanations for the sequence of events that had saved our marriage. But a larger part of me had experienced something too personal, too specific, too intricately orchestrated to be explained away as mere chance. "I think," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, "that we were being watched over by someone who loved us more than we loved ourselves. Someone who could see possibilities we couldn't see and was willing to arrange circumstances in ways that would lead us toward healing even when we were too proud or too scared to ask for help directly." Sarah nodded, and I could see that she'd arrived at the same conclusion through her own experience of perfectly timed provision and gentle guidance toward exactly what we'd needed most. We'd been watched over, protected, guided, loved through our crisis, by a presence that had never stopped believing in the possibility of resurrection even when we'd given up believing in it ourselves. Gratitude had awakened something in both of us that felt like worship. Not the formal kind that happened during church services, but the spontaneous kind that overflowed from hearts that had been rescued from despair and given reasons to hope again. I found myself praying throughout the day, while driving to work, while folding laundry, while falling asleep next to Sarah, not asking for things, but simply expressing amazement at being allowed to live inside such abundant love. Sarah had started singing again, something she'd done constantly during our early years of marriage, but had gradually stopped as our relationship became more stressful and less joyful. Now I'd hear her humming while she got ready for work, singing along to music while she cooked, sometimes even making up little songs about whatever she was doing in the moment. The house felt alive with music again, filled with the sound of someone who was happy to be exactly where she was. We'd both begun seeing ordinary moments as sacred, sharing coffee in the morning, discussing our days over dinner, working together on weekend projects around the house. These simple domestic rituals had taken on a depth and significance they'd never had before, as if we were both aware that being able to share daily life with someone you loved was a privilege that not everyone got to experience, something worthy of conscious appreciation rather than unconscious assumption. I'd started keeping a gratitude journal, writing down 3 things each evening that I was thankful for from that particular day. Some days the list included dramatic items, breakthroughs in counseling sessions, moments of unexpected intimacy with Sarah, insights that changed how I understood love or marriage or my relationship with God. But more often, the list was made up of small, ordinary gifts. Sarah laughing at something I'd said, the way afternoon light looked in our living room, the fact that we'd made it through another day of choosing each other despite all the reasons we could have chosen differently. Sarah had her own practices, lighting candles during dinner, taking long walks where she prayed or meditated or simply noticed the beauty of our neighborhood, writing letters to friends and family members, expressing appreciation for their presence in her life. She'd become someone who noticed sunsets and flowers and the way children played in the park, someone who was awake to the constant presence of beauty and grace in the world around her. Our shared spiritual practices had become deeper and more meaningful too. We'd started reading devotional books together in the evenings, not because we felt obligated to maintain some kind of religious routine, but because we genuinely enjoyed learning about faith and love and the ways other people had navigated the challenges of staying connected to God and each other over the long haul. We'd joined a small group at our church, 8 couples who met twice a month to discuss marriage and faith and the practical challenges of living out Christian principles in real relationships with real problems. Being part of that community had shown us that we weren't the only people who'd struggled with love, weren't the only couple who'd had to work to rebuild trust and intimacy after damaging it through selfishness and neglect. Hearing other couples' stories of crisis and recovery had reinforced our growing understanding that marriage was meant to be a spiritual discipline, a way of learning how to love unconditionally by practicing on someone who was close enough to hurt you and patient enough to forgive you when you inevitably made mistakes. Our marriage had become a laboratory for grace, a place where we could experiment with loving each other the way God loved us, constantly, generously, with hope that never gave up on the possibility of growth and change. The Bible verses that had once appeared as mysterious text messages on my phone had been replaced by an internal soundtrack of scripture that seemed to provide commentary and encouragement for whatever Sarah and I were experiencing on any given day. Psalm 121 had become particularly meaningful, especially the verses about God watching over our coming and going, keeping us from harm, preserving our lives with the kind of vigilant care that never slept or grew tired or looked away even for a moment. When I thought about our marriage crisis and recovery, those words took on personal significance that made them feel less like ancient poetry and more like contemporary promises. God really had been watching over us during our months of separation and conflict, really had been preserving our relationship even when we'd been actively trying to destroy it through our own fear and selfishness and inability to love each other well. Isaiah 49:16 had also become a source of constant comfort, the image of being engraved on the palms of God's hands, permanently inscribed in divine memory and attention in ways that couldn't be erased or forgotten or overlooked. During our worst moments, when it had felt like we were invisible to heaven and abandoned to figure out our problems without any supernatural assistance, we'd actually been held in the most intimate possible way, carried through our crisis by hands that had never stopped working on our behalf. But the verse that had become most central to how I understood our entire experience was Isaiah 41:10. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." This had been the promise that had sustained me through the bathroom encounter and continued to anchor me whenever I felt overwhelmed by the ongoing work of learning how to love Sarah well. Fear had been the root of so many of our problems. My fear of not being enough for her, her fear of being taken for granted, both of our fears of being truly known and potentially rejected. But we'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the choice to act in love despite fear, to risk vulnerability despite the possibility of being hurt, to trust in God's presence and provision even when we couldn't see evidence of either. Sarah had her own collection of verses that had become personally meaningful during our recovery. Ephesians 4:32, about being kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as God had forgiven us in Christ. 1 Corinthians 13, about love being patient and kind, not self-seeking or easily angered, keeping no record of wrongs. Ecclesiastes 4:12, about a cord of 3 strands not being quickly broken, which he interpreted as our marriage being strengthened by God's presence woven throughout our relationship. These weren't verses we'd memorized through discipline or religious duty, but words that had become part of our internal vocabulary because they describe so accurately what we'd experienced of divine love and human possibility. They'd become the soundtrack to our daily life, the background music that reminded us constantly of the larger story we were part of. The love story that included our marriage but extended far beyond it to encompass God's relentless pursuit of every human heart that was willing to be found and healed and transformed. "We're not finished here," I thought one evening as we sat on our back porch watching the sunset paint our neighborhood in shades of gold and pink, our hands intertwined and our hearts full of gratitude for being given a second chance at the kind of love that could survive anything life might bring. "We're just beginning to understand how deep this love goes, how wide this grace extends, how much more there is to discover about what it means to be held by hands that will never let us go." The archaeology of our marriage crisis had revealed layer after layer of divine provision and protection, evidence that we'd been watched over and cared for and guided toward healing even when we'd felt most alone. But more than that, it had revealed that our story was part of a much larger story, one in which broken things could be made beautiful, lost things could be found, and love could triumph over fear in ways that felt miraculous but were actually just the natural result of finally learning how to receive and give the grace that had been available all along. God is watching, I realized, with a peace that went deeper than understanding, not with judgment or disappointment, but with the patient, persistent, transformative love of someone who sees exactly who we are and loves us enough to help us become exactly who we're meant to be. Together. 1 year after our kitchen confrontation that had almost ended everything, I woke up on a Saturday morning to find Sarah already awake beside me, not staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone calculating escape routes like she had during our worst months, but watching me sleep with the soft smile of someone who was genuinely happy to be exactly where she was. The morning light filtering through our bedroom curtains caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes, and for a moment I felt like I was seeing her for the first time. Not the woman I'd been married to for 14 years, but the person she'd always been underneath all the hurt and disappointment and careful self-protection we'd both developed during our crisis. "Good morning," she whispered, reaching over to brush a piece of hair off my forehead in the kind of tender gesture that had once been automatic between us, had disappeared during our months of careful distance, and was now returning as a natural expression of affection rather than obligation. "Good morning," I replied, marveling at how different those simple words felt now compared to the careful politeness they'd carried during our worst periods. These weren't the good mornings of people who were trying not to trigger each other's defensiveness, but the greetings of two people who were genuinely glad to start another day together. As I lay there looking at my wife, really looking at her, the way I used to during our honeymoon when studying her face felt like exploring territory I'd been given exclusive rights to love, I realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just in how we related to each other, but in how I experienced the basic reality of being alive. The low-level anxiety that had been my constant companion for years had been replaced by something I could only describe as peace. Not the fragile kind that depended on circumstances staying favorable, but the deep kind that came from knowing I was exactly where I belonged, with exactly the right person, held by a love that was bigger than both of us. Sarah stretched and rolled closer to me, resting her head on my chest in a gesture that felt both familiar and miraculous, like recovering a treasure you'd thought was lost forever. "I had the strangest dream," she said, her voice still soft with sleep. "We were old, like really old, sitting on a porch swing watching our grandchildren play in the yard. But the weird part was that I could remember everything, our wedding, our fights, that terrible year when we almost gave up, this morning, right now. And in the dream, I was so grateful for all of it, even the hard parts, because they'd led us to that porch swing." I tightened my arms around her, understanding exactly what she meant. The crisis that had almost destroyed us had also taught us things about love and commitment and the nature of grace that we never could have learned through easy happiness. We'd been forced to discover whether our marriage was built on a foundation strong enough to survive disappointment, whether our love was deep enough to choose forgiveness over resentment, whether we were willing to do the hard work of becoming people worth staying married to. "I think that's what resurrection looks like," I said, the words coming from a place of understanding that felt deeper than intellectual knowledge. Not just coming back to life, but coming back to life with the wisdom that only comes from having been through death and discovering that death isn't the end of the story. Our marriage hadn't just survived our crisis, it had been transformed by it. We weren't the same people who'd stood at that altar 14 years ago, promising to love each other through sickness and health, without really understanding what sickness meant, what health required, what love demanded, when it was tested by the ordinary disappointments and extraordinary pressures that every long-term relationship had to navigate. We were people who'd learned that love wasn't just a feeling, but a choice that had to be made repeatedly, sometimes hourly, sometimes in direct opposition to what felt easy or comfortable or immediately rewarding. We were people who discovered that marriage was less like a romantic movie and more like a spiritual discipline, a daily practice of choosing each other's well-being over our own comfort, each other's growth over our own convenience, each other's happiness over our own immediate desires. But we were also people who'd experienced firsthand the miraculous transformation that was possible when two broken people were willing to be healed together, when two scared people chose courage together, when two selfish people learned generosity together through the patient guidance of a love that was bigger than both their individual capacities for love. As spring turned into summer, Sarah and I began talking more seriously about what our experience meant. Not just for us, but for other couples who might be struggling with the same kinds of challenges we'd faced. Our story felt too significant to keep to ourselves, too full of hope and practical wisdom to be hoarded as private treasure rather than shared as public testimony to the possibility of resurrection in relationships that seemed beyond saving. It started with small conversations, friends who noticed the change in us and asked what had happened, couples in our small group who were going through their own rough patches and wanted to know how we'd navigated the territory between crisis and recovery. We found ourselves becoming informal counselors, not because we had all the answers, but because we'd lived through questions that others were just beginning to ask. "You guys give me hope," said Jennifer, a woman in our small group whose marriage was straining under the pressure of job loss and financial stress. "6 months ago, you looked like you were barely holding it together. Now, you look like newlyweds again. If you can figure it out, maybe there's hope for the rest of us." Her comment made me realize how visible our transformation had been to the people around us. We hadn't been trying to present ourselves as a success story or hide the fact that we'd almost divorced. In fact, our honesty about our struggles had made us more relatable to other couples rather than less. But somehow, without conscious effort, we'd become living proof that marriages could survive seemingly impossible challenges and emerge stronger rather than just intact. Dr. Martinez had noticed the change too. During what would turn out to be one of our final counseling sessions, she observed that we'd moved from being people who were working on their marriage to people who were simply married. A subtle but significant distinction that marked the difference between a relationship that required constant maintenance and one that had found its natural rhythm. "What you've accomplished is remarkable," she told us. "Not just that you've saved your marriage, but that you've created a marriage worth saving. You've become the kind of people who can weather difficulties together rather than being torn apart by them." Her words helped us understand that our crisis had been about more than just learning better communication skills or resolving specific conflicts. It had been about becoming people who were capable of the kind of love that could sustain a lifelong commitment. People who understood that marriage was meant to be a sanctuary where two imperfect humans could practice unconditional love on each other until they got good at it. Sarah had started talking about wanting to become a marriage mentor, someone who could walk alongside other couples during their own crisis periods and offer the kind of hope and practical guidance we'd received from various sources during our recovery. "I keep thinking about how alone I felt during the worst part," she said. "Like we were the only couple who'd ever struggled this way, like everyone else had figured out some secret to marriage that we'd missed entirely." I understood what she meant. One of the most healing aspects of our recovery had been discovering that our problems weren't unique, that countless other couples had walked similar paths and emerged with similar stories of grace and transformation. The isolation of thinking we were uniquely broken had been almost as damaging as the actual problems in our relationship. "Maybe that's what we're supposed to do with this," I suggested. "Not hide what we've been through, but use it to help other people believe that their marriages can survive too." The idea felt both exciting and terrifying. Exciting because it gave our suffering meaning beyond just our personal growth. Terrifying because it would require a level of vulnerability and transparency that went far beyond what most people were comfortable sharing about their private lives. But the more we talked about it, the more it felt like a calling rather than just an idea. We'd been given a second chance, not just for our own happiness, but so we could offer hope to others who were facing the same choice between quitting and fighting that we'd once faced. Our story belonged not just to us, but to the larger community of people who were learning that love was possible even when it felt impossible, that grace was available even when it seemed undeserved. By fall, our sense of mission had crystallized into concrete action. We'd started a monthly support group at our church for couples in crisis, not a formal therapy group, but an informal gathering where people could share their stories and receive encouragement from others who understood the particular challenges of trying to rebuild love after it had been damaged by neglect or conflict, or the simple erosion that happened when two people stopped paying attention to each other's hearts. The first meeting drew 3 couples besides ourselves, all of them in various stages of marital difficulty, ranging from mild dissatisfaction to active separation. As we sat in a circle in one of the church's small meeting rooms, sharing coffee and awkward introductions, I felt both honored and humbled to be trusted with other people's private pain, their secret fears about whether love could really survive the realities of long-term commitment. "We've been married for 22 years, said Tom, a man about our age whose wife Linda sat beside him with the careful posture of someone who was present but not entirely convinced this was a good idea. "The last 5 have been difficult. We don't fight exactly, but we don't really talk either. We're like roommates who happen to share kids, and a mortgage. His description was so similar to where Sarah and I had been just a year earlier that I felt a physical ache of recognition and compassion. "That's exactly how we felt," I said, "like we were living parallel lives that occasionally intersected but never really connected anymore." Over the course of that first meeting, it became clear that every couple in the room was dealing with some variation of the same core issues we'd faced: the gradual erosion of intimacy, the replacement of friendship with obligation, the sense that they'd become strangers to people they'd once known better than anyone else in the world. But it also became clear that none of them had given up entirely, or they wouldn't have come to a marriage support group on a Tuesday evening instead of staying home to watch television in separate rooms. They were all still hoping for something better, still willing to believe that the love they'd once shared could be recovered and renewed if they could just figure out how to access it again. Sarah shared about the months when we'd slept in separate rooms, the fights that had revealed years of accumulated resentment, the moment when we'd both realized we didn't know what we wanted anymore, except that we couldn't continue the way we'd been going. I talked about my resistance to counseling, my pride that had almost prevented us from getting the help we'd needed, the spiritual breakthrough that had changed how I understood both divine love and human love. "The thing that surprised me most," Linda said after we'd finished our story, "is that you're both here. Together. You look like you actually like each other again." Her observation made me aware of how we'd been sitting during the meeting, close enough that our knees were touching, Sarah's hand resting on my arm in the unconscious way of people who were comfortable with casual physical affection, both of us contributing to the conversation as partners rather than adversaries with competing versions of the same events. "We do like each other again," Sarah replied, and I could hear wonder in her voice like someone describing a miracle. "But it took work to get back here. And help. Lots of help." By the end of that first meeting, all three couples had committed to returning the following month, and word had already begun to spread to other people in our church and community who were struggling with their marriages. Within 6 months, our little support group had grown to include 12 couples, ranging from newlyweds who wanted to learn healthy conflict resolution skills to couples married for decades who were trying to reconnect after years of gradual drift. We weren't therapists or experts or people with perfect marriages, but we were people who'd been through the fire and come out believing more strongly than ever in the possibility of love that could survive anything. We were wounded healers, people whose scars had become credentials for ministry to others who were still bleeding from similar wounds. The most profound moment in our ministry to other couples came during our 8th monthly meeting, when a woman named Carol broke down sobbing in the middle of sharing about her husband's recent request for a separation. They'd been married for 18 years, had 2 teenage children, and had been drifting apart for so long that neither of them could remember when they'd last had a conversation that went deeper than logistics and scheduling. "He says he loves me, but he's not in love with me anymore," she said through tears that seemed to be coming from a place deeper than grief, from a place where hope goes to die. "He says we've become different people than we were when we got married, and maybe we should both be free to find people we're more compatible with now." Her husband, Mark, sat beside her with the expression of someone who was trying to be kind while delivering devastating news, someone who'd clearly thought through his position carefully and arrived at conclusions that felt reasonable to him but apocalyptic to his wife. "I don't want to hurt her," he said, and his voice carried genuine sadness, even as it carried finality. "But I can't keep pretending to feel something I don't feel anymore. We're both good people, but maybe we're just not good for each other anymore." As I listened to Mark articulate his position, I heard echoes of thoughts I'd entertained during our darkest moments, the rational arguments for ending a marriage that had stopped bringing joy to either person involved. There was a logic to his reasoning that was hard to argue with. If love was gone, if compatibility had evaporated, if both people would be happier apart than together, what was the point of continuing to force something that felt artificial and unsustainable? But I also heard something else in his voice, something underneath the certainty and rationality that sounded like fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of the work required to rebuild intimacy, fear of hoping for change and being disappointed again. "Can I tell you what I think I'm hearing?" I asked gently, and Mark nodded with the wariness of someone who expected to be challenged but was willing to listen. "I think I hear someone who's scared," I said. "Not just someone who's fallen out of love, but someone who's afraid of how much work it might take to fall back in love. Someone who's afraid of being vulnerable enough to let his wife matter to him the way she used to matter." Mark was quiet for a long moment, and I could see that my words had landed somewhere important, had touched something he'd been trying not to examine too closely. "Maybe," he admitted finally, "maybe I am scared. Scared of trying and failing again. Scared of getting my hopes up that we could be happy together and then discovering that we're just too different now, that too much damage has been done." This was the conversation I'd needed to have with myself a year earlier, but had been too proud and too frightened to initiate. The conversation about whether the risk of trying was worth the possibility of failing, whether love was worth fighting for, even when fighting felt exhausting and uncertain and potentially futile. "We were scared too," Sarah said, reaching across the circle to take Carol's hand. "Terrified. I spent months convinced that we'd damaged our marriage beyond repair, that we'd hurt each other too much to ever trust each other again." She looked at me then, and I could see in her eyes the same gratitude I felt every day for being given a second chance at love we'd almost thrown away. But we learned that scared doesn't have to mean hopeless. Scared can just mean the stakes are high, that what you're fighting for matters enough to be worth the risk. The conversation that followed was one of the most honest discussions about marriage and fear and the nature of love that I'd ever been part of. Mark and Carol talked about when they'd first started drifting apart, about the small resentments that had accumulated into large walls, about the ways they'd both stopped trying to understand each other and started just trying to coexist without too much conflict. But they also talked about what they missed about each other, about the friendship they'd once shared, about the family they'd built together and didn't want to see destroyed by their inability to reconnect as a couple. By the end of the evening, Mark hadn't withdrawn his request for separation, but he'd agreed to try counseling first, to give their marriage 6 months of intentional effort before making any permanent decisions about their future together. "I can't promise I'll change my mind," he said to Carol as they prepared to leave, "but I can promise I'll try. Really try. Not just go through the motions, but actually work to see if we can find each other again." 6 months later, Mark and Carol were leading their own small group for couples in crisis, sharing their story of near divorce and recommitment with other people who needed to believe that love could survive seasons of doubt and disconnection. As our second anniversary of recommitment approached, not our wedding anniversary, but the anniversary of that dinner when we decided to really try again, I found myself reflecting on how profoundly our understanding of marriage itself had changed through our crisis and recovery. We'd gotten married with the typical American expectation that marriage was primarily about personal happiness, that we'd chosen each other because being together made us feel good about ourselves and our lives. When being together stopped feeling good, when marriage started requiring sacrifice and compromise and the constant choice to prioritize someone else's well-being over our own comfort, we'd interpreted that as evidence that we'd made a mistake, that we weren't meant to be together after all. But our crisis had taught us that marriage was never meant to be primarily about happiness. It was meant to be about holiness, about becoming the kinds of people who were capable of loving unconditionally, about learning to reflect divine love in the most intimate human relationship possible. The happiness we'd found on the other side of our crisis was different from the happiness we'd experienced as newlyweds. It was deeper, more stable, rooted in something stronger than compatibility or shared interests, or the easy affection of two people who hadn't yet discovered all the ways they could disappoint each other. This new happiness came from knowing that our love could survive disappointment, that our commitment was stronger than our feelings, that we'd chosen each other not just for the good times, but especially for the difficult times when choosing each other required everything we had to give. "I think this is what 'till death do us part' actually means," Sarah said one evening as we sat on our back porch, watching the sunset paint our neighborhood in shades of gold and pink that reminded me of the light that had filled our bathroom the night I'd encountered God's voice directly. "Not just that we'll stay married until one of us dies, but that we'll keep choosing each other until the selfish parts of us die, until we become people who love each other the way God loves us." Her words captured something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate, that our marriage had become a spiritual practice, a way of learning what divine love looked like when it was expressed through human choice and commitment and daily acts of service and sacrifice. Every morning when I woke up next to Sarah, every time I chose patience over irritation when she did something that annoyed me, every time I prioritized her needs over my own convenience, I was practicing a kind of love that reflected something eternal and sacred and infinitely bigger than my own capacity for affection. Marriage had become less about finding someone who completed me and more about becoming someone who could reflect God's completeness to another person. Less about having my needs met and more about learning to meet someone else's needs, joyfully, generously, as an overflow of the love I'd received from the ultimate source of all love. This shift in perspective had changed everything about how we approached not just our relationship, but our entire lives. Work became less about personal advancement and more about how we could use our skills and resources to serve others. Friendships became less about what we could gain and more about what we could contribute. Even our material possessions took on a different significance. They were tools for hospitality and generosity, rather than symbols of success or security. The couples we mentored often asked us what the secret was, what we'd learned that had transformed our marriage from a source of pain into a source of joy. The answer was always the same, though it took different forms depending on who was asking and what their particular struggles were. The secret was surrender, not the kind of surrender that meant giving up or accepting defeat, but the kind that meant giving over, releasing control of outcomes we'd never actually been able to control anyway. Trusting that love was bigger than our ability to understand it, or manage it, or earn it through good behavior. We'd surrendered our marriage to God, which paradoxically had given it back to us in a form we never could have created through our own efforts. We'd stopped trying to make each other happy and started trying to love each other faithfully. And happiness had arrived as a natural byproduct of faithful love, rather than as the primary goal we were striving to achieve. On a quiet Sunday evening in late November, exactly 2 years after that first tentative dinner when we decided to try again, Sarah and I found ourselves sitting in our kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd had our devastating fight, where I'd picked up the pieces of broken china that had felt like broken promises, where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations and small moments of domestic intimacy that had taught us what it meant to build a life together. The kitchen table was set with our wedding china, the dishes we'd replaced after breaking several pieces during our worst fights, the pattern that Sarah's grandmother had chosen for us with such hope and faith in our future together. The food was simple: pasta with homemade sauce, salad from our garden, bread from the bakery where we'd bought our wedding cake 14 years earlier. But the atmosphere was anything but simple. It felt sacred, weighted with significance and gratitude, and the kind of joy that comes from knowing you've been given a gift you almost refused to accept. "I keep thinking about that night," Sarah said, and I knew she was referring to our kitchen confrontation that had almost ended everything. How close we came to walking away from all of this. I reached across the table and took her hand, marveling at how different this gesture felt now compared to 2 years ago, when even casual physical contact had felt fraught with potential conflict or misunderstanding. "I'm glad we didn't," I said, and the words felt inadequate to express the depth of gratitude I felt for being given a second chance at a love I'd almost been too scared and stubborn to fight for. As we sat there holding hands across our kitchen table, I felt the same presence I'd experienced during my bathroom encounter with the divine voice that had changed everything about how I understood love and identity and the nature of grace. But this time, the presence felt less like a voice speaking to me and more like a blessing being pronounced over us, a commissioning for whatever came next in our journey of learning how to love each other and others with the kind of love we'd received. "Love as I have loved you," came the whisper, and this time Sarah heard it too. I could see it in her face, the sudden stillness that meant she was listening to something beyond the ordinary sounds of our ordinary evening. "Love as I have loved you, unconditionally, sacrificially, with hope that never gives up on the possibility of transformation. Love others the way you have learned to love each other, with patience for their journey and faith in their capacity for growth and grace for their mistakes and celebration for their victories." The commissioning felt both specific and universal, specific to our calling to minister to other couples who were struggling with the same challenges we'd faced, universal in its application to every relationship and interaction and opportunity to choose love over fear that we'd encounter for the rest of our lives. We'd been given a love story, not just for our own happiness, but for the encouragement of others who needed to believe that love could survive anything, that grace was always available, that resurrection was possible even when death seemed certain. "Your story belongs to me now," the voice continued, and I understood that this wasn't about ownership, but about purpose, about the way our private pain and recovery had become public testimony to the power of love that refused to give up on people, even when they gave up on themselves. "Tell them what you have seen. Tell them what you have learned. Tell them that I am watching, always watching, with eyes full of love and hands ready to help, and a heart that breaks when they break and rejoices when they choose love over fear." As the presence gradually faded, leaving behind a peace that felt deeper than any happiness we'd ever experienced, Sarah and I looked at each other across our kitchen table and understood that our marriage had become something bigger than just the relationship between two people who'd learned how to love each other well. We'd become ambassadors of grace, living proof that broken things could be made beautiful, that lost things could be found, that love could triumph over fear in ways that felt miraculous, but were actually just the natural result of finally learning how to receive and give the grace that had been available all along. "Before you quit," I thought, remembering the desperate moments when quitting had felt like the only rational choice, "remember that God is watching. Not with condemnation, but with compassion. Not with judgment, but with hope. Not with disappointment, but with the infinite patience of someone who knows that the best stories are often the ones that look like tragedies until the final chapter reveals them to have been love stories all along." Our marriage had become one of those stories, a love story disguised as a tragedy until grace revealed its true nature, a testimony to the power of divine love to transform human love into something that could reflect eternity in the most ordinary moments of daily life. We're not finished here, I realized with deep contentment. We're just beginning to understand how much love there is to give, how many people need to hear that their stories don't have to end in divorce court, or broken dreams, or the quiet desperation of two people who've forgotten how to be friends. We're just beginning to discover what it means to love as we have been loved, to watch over others the way we have been watched over, to offer hope to the hopeless and healing to the broken and second chances to those who thought they'd used up all their chances. God is watching, I understood, finally. Always watching, always loving, always working to bring beauty from ashes and joy from mourning and the oil of gladness instead of the spirit of despair. And now, through our story, others would know that they were being watched over too.